Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into the most intimate space of medieval life, the marriage bed, but not to discover what was said there. No, we're here to uncover something far more haunting, the words that were never spoken, the confessions that died on trembling lips, the truths that husbands and wives carried to their graves, locked behind silence and propriety. Imagine ending your entire life sleeping beside someone you could never truly know, never fully speak to, never completely trust with the secrets of your heart. That was medieval marriage, and tonight you'll understand why. Before we step into this world together, I want to ask something of you. If this story moves you, if it makes you think or feel something new, would you take just a moment to subscribe to this channel and leave a like? It truly helps me continue bringing these forgotten histories to life. And I'm curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you in bed letting the day drift away? Or perhaps you're traveling, escaping into another time? Drop a comment and let me know. I love hearing from you. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's walk together into a medieval wedding night where almost nothing could be said, but everything was felt. Picture this. It's a cool autumn evening in the year 1252. Somewhere in the English countryside, in a stone manor house lit by flickering candles, a girl of 14 sits on the edge of a bed she's never seen before. Her name is Eleanor. Though history won't remember her, she's not a queen, not a lady of great renown, just the daughter of a minor nobleman whose father needed an alliance and whose mother needed one less mouth to feed. She wears a white linen shift, her hair unbraided for the first time in the presence of a man, and that man standing awkwardly near the door is now her husband. His name is Robert, he is 23 years old, they met for the first time this morning at the church door. Let me say that again, because I want you to really feel the weight of it. They met this morning, 9 hours ago, and now they're expected to consummate a lifelong bond with someone who is, in every meaningful sense, a complete stranger. This wasn't unusual. This was normal. For the nobility of medieval Europe, marriage was a business transaction, a political chess move, a transfer of property rights wrapped in religious ceremony. Love? That was for songs and stories, for the fantasy world of courtly romance where knights pined for ladies they could never have. But real marriage, the kind that actually happened, the kind that shaped dynasties and controlled land, that had nothing to do with love, and if love wasn't part of the equation, then neither were the words that love requires. Eleanor cannot ask Robert what he's thinking. She cannot say she's frightened. She cannot admit that she barely understands what's about to happen, that the women who prepared her spoke in whispers and euphemisms, that her mother simply told her to be obedient and all would be well. The church taught that sex was for procreation, not pleasure, and that women who enjoyed it were dangerously sinful. So Eleanor has been trained her whole life to not speak of desire, to not voice fear, to not express anything that might reveal the thundering of her heart beneath that linen shift. And Robert? He cannot tell her that he wanted to marry someone else, that he had hoped for the daughter of the Earl 2 counties over, a match that would have brought more land, more status. He cannot confess that he finds this situation nearly as awkward as she does, that he barely remembers her name from the ceremony, that he too is frightened of getting this wrong. Medieval masculinity demanded strength, control, authority. To admit fear or uncertainty would be to admit weakness, and a husband could never appear weak before his wife. That would upset the entire hierarchy upon which society was built. So they exist in separate silences, in the same room, about to share the same bed, legally bound until death. And yet they cannot bridge the chasm between them with honest words. Let me tell you about someone history did remember, because her story illustrates this perfectly. Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful women of the Middle Ages, Duchess of Aquitaine, Queen of France, and later Queen of England. In 1137, when she was 15 years old, she married Louis VII, King of France. It was a spectacular wedding, the union of two great powers. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. What did Eleanor say to Louis on their wedding night? What did she feel? We know she was educated, strong-willed, politically astute. We know Louis was deeply pious, almost monk-like in his devotion to the church. We know their marriage eventually crumbled, but we don't know what they said to each other in private because such things were not recorded. Even for queens, the intimate vocabulary of marriage was considered too private, too unimportant, or perhaps too dangerous to document. Because here's the thing, and this is crucial to understanding medieval marriage, words had power. To speak was to make something real. If a husband admitted to his wife that he doubted the wisdom of their match, that could become treason if the match was politically motivated by the king. If a wife confessed that she loved another man, even if she'd never acted on it, that confession alone could be grounds for severe punishment. The medieval world operated on the principle that thoughts unexpressed were thoughts that didn't exist. Silence was safety, but silence was also suffering. Imagine living with someone for 30, 40, 50 years and never being able to say, "I'm lonely," never being able to say, "Do you think about me kindly?" Never being able to ask, "What do you dream about?" These weren't just romantic sentiments that medieval people didn't value. These were fundamental human needs for connection that the structure of medieval marriage actively suppressed. The wedding night I described earlier with Eleanor and Robert would have had witnesses. Yes, witnesses. In many noble households, family members and important guests would accompany the couple to the bedrooms, see them into bed, and wait outside the door or even in the room itself to ensure the marriage was consummated. This wasn't considered invasive, it was necessary. The validity of the marriage depended on consummation. Too many marriages had been disputed, annulled or called into question because there was no proof of consummation. So witnesses were required. Can you imagine trying to have any kind of honest conversation, any moment of human vulnerability, with an audience waiting to verify your performance? Eleanor cannot whisper to Robert, "Could we wait? Could we just talk first? I'm so frightened." Not with his uncle standing guard outside the door. Robert cannot gently ask, "Are you well? Do you understand what we're expected to do?" Not when the validity of a land alliance hangs on their success. And here's something that might surprise you. The church said that consent was necessary for marriage. Both the man and the woman had to say "I do" for the marriage to be valid. Pope Alexander III in the late 12th century established that marriage was based on consent, not consummation. The exchange of promises, "I take you as my husband, I take you as my wife," that was enough. In theory, this gave women unprecedented power. In theory, no one could be forced into marriage, but theory and reality were miles apart. Because what is consent when you're 12 years old and your father tells you that the survival of your family depends on this match? What is consent when you're a girl who's been taught since birth that obedience is your highest virtue? That to refuse your parents is to sin against God himself? What is consent when the alternative to marriage is a convent or poverty or shame upon your entire family? So Eleanor said "I do" at the church door this morning. Her voice was barely audible, but the priest heard it, the witnesses heard it, and now it's done, legal, binding, forever. And what she actually meant, what she wanted to say, "I'm terrified. I don't know this man. I'm not ready." Those words evaporated in the autumn air, never to be retrieved. Margaret Beaufort is another name you should know. She was married at 12 years old to Edmund Tudor. 12, She gave birth to her only child, the future King Henry VII of England, when she was 13. The birth nearly killed her, damaged her so severely that she could never have children again. Years later, she said that she believed girls should not marry until they were at least 16, that she had been too young, that it had harmed her. But she never said that to Edmund. She couldn't. He died before she could fully articulate what had been done to her, and even if he had lived, could she have told him? Could a child bride tell her adult husband, "This is hurting me, you're hurting me, please stop"? Medieval marriage said no. The church said that both spouses owed each other the marriage debt, that is, sex on demand. To refuse was to sin. So Margaret suffered in silence, her body bearing witness to the words she could never say. Let me be clear about something. Not every medieval marriage was loveless. Not every couple was strangers. We know from letters, from poetry, from legal documents that some couples grew to care for each other deeply. Some even fell in love after marriage. The idea that medieval people were cold and emotionless is false. They felt everything we feel: joy, sorrow, passion, longing. But they didn't have the vocabulary to express it within marriage. Love was something that happened despite the institution, not because of it. There's a beautiful, tragic irony in medieval literature. The greatest love stories of the era, Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, courtly romances sung by troubadours across Europe, they're all about adultery. They're all about love outside of marriage, because marriage itself was understood to be incompatible with passionate love. Marriage was duty, love was transgression. So if you were a medieval wife who found herself genuinely in love with your husband, there was no framework for expressing it. You couldn't say "I love you," because that phrase belonged to the world of courtly romance, the world of illegitimate passion. To say it to your husband might imply that your marriage was somehow improper, that you'd confused your roles, that you'd forgotten that marriage was a sacrament of duty, not a celebration of feeling. And the men faced their own silences. A medieval husband couldn't tell his wife that he was struggling, that he feared he couldn't protect her, that he worried about money or politics or war. To do so would be to violate the fundamental principle of medieval masculinity, the husband as lord, as master, as the unshakable foundation of the household. The architecture of medieval society required men to be silent about vulnerability and women to be silent about everything else. Back to our Eleanor and Robert, now alone finally, the witnesses having departed. The candle burns low. Robert has done his duty, awkwardly, quickly. Eleanor stares at the ceiling beams, feeling a dull ache and a profound sense of loneliness she cannot name. She wants to will it always be like this? She wants to know, do you think you could ever care for me? She wants to whisper, I'm not who you wanted, am I? But she says nothing, because she's been taught that a good wife is a silent wife, that her thoughts are less important than her obedience, that her feelings are at best irrelevant, and at worst dangerous. And Robert, lying beside this girl who is now his wife, thinks about the life stretching ahead of them, decades perhaps, in the same house, raising children together, managing lands together, eating meals together, sleeping in the same bed, all of it unfolding in a strange, careful silence. He wants to say, I'll try to be kind to you. He wants to promise, I won't hurt you if I can help it. He wants to ask, what do you need from me? But he says nothing. Because he's been taught that a man who seeks a woman's counsel is weak, that his authority depends on mystery, on distance, on never revealing the uncertainty that gnaws at his chest. So they lie there, two strangers, legally one flesh, spiritually united by sacrament, practically divided by everything that matters, and the silence between them is not peaceful. It's heavy, textured with all the words that will never be said, all the questions that will never be asked, all the confessions that will die unspoken. This is what medieval marriage was for so many. Not a joining of souls, but a business arrangement. Not a partnership, but a hierarchy. Not a conversation, but a long, echoing silence punctuated by duty and expectation and the grinding machinery of social order. And we've only just scratched the surface. We've only explored the wedding night, the first silence. But there were so many more. Silences about money, about sex, about children, about power, about violence, about death. Each one its own kind of prison. Each one its own untold story. Eleanor and Robert will wake tomorrow, well, perhaps not tomorrow for them, but in our next chapter, to face a new set of unspoken rules. Because if they couldn't talk about love on their wedding night, wait until you hear what they couldn't discuss about money. The dowry that bought Eleanor, the property that Robert controls but cannot discuss, the inheritance that will determine their children's lives but remains a forbidden topic at the dinner table. Medieval marriage wasn't just about personal silence, it was about economic silence too, and that silence had teeth. But that's a story for the next part of our journey. For now, rest with this image. Two people bound together forever, unable to speak the simplest truths of their hearts. It's heartbreaking, yes, but it's also deeply human, because in their sense we hear echoes of every relationship where pride or fear or social expectation has kept us from saying what we really mean. Medieval marriage might seem distant, but the ache of unspoken words, that's timeless. Sleep well. We'll continue this story together very soon. Now, let's talk about something that might surprise you. In medieval England, women could own property. They could inherit land. They could, legally speaking, be quite wealthy in their own right. Sounds progressive, doesn't it? But here's the twist that makes this story so fascinating. Even though women could own property, they couldn't talk about it. Not really. Not in the ways that mattered. The money that changed hands at a medieval wedding was staggering, but it moved in whispers, in documents signed by fathers and lawyers, in negotiations that happened in rooms where the bride herself was never present. And once married, a woman might live in a house built on land she technically owned, eat food purchased with money that was legally hers, and yet she could never, ever sit down with her husband and say, "Let's discuss our finances." That conversation simply didn't exist. Let me introduce you to someone who understood this better than most. Her name was Joan of Kent, and she lived in the 14th century. Joan was extraordinary, granddaughter of King Edward I, cousin to King Edward III, and eventually the mother of King Richard II. She was also, by all accounts, quite beautiful and remarkably independent for her time. But Joan's first marriage tells us everything we need to know about medieval women and money. When Joan was around 12 years old, she secretly married a man named Thomas Holland. Secret marriages were actually valid in medieval England. All you needed were mutual consent and ideally consummation. No priest required, no witnesses necessary, just two people saying, "I take you" to each other. Joan and Thomas did exactly that. But here's where it gets interesting. Thomas then left for war in Flanders, and while he was gone, Joan's family married her off to William Montagu, the son of an earl. Why? Money, land, political alliance. The fact that Joan was already married to Thomas was inconvenient, so everyone simply pretended it hadn't happened. Now, Joan knew she was married to Thomas. William probably suspected something. But could Joan say to William, "I cannot marry you because I'm already someone else's wife"? She tried apparently, but no one listened. Could she say, "The dowry you're receiving is being given under false pretenses"? Absolutely not. That would be accusing her own family of fraud. Could she even whisper to a friend, "I don't know how to fix this. I'm trapped between two husbands," not without risking everything? The dowry system was the engine of medieval marriage, but it was an engine that ran on silence. Here's how it worked. When a girl married, her family gave the groom's family a dowry. Money, land, livestock, household goods, whatever was agreed upon. This was supposed to be the bride's contribution to the marriage, her security. But the moment the wedding happened, that property became her husband's to control. He owned it in name only. He managed it, spent from it, invested it, sold it if he wished. And she couldn't question his decisions. Think about that. Your family gives away a substantial portion of their wealth to secure your marriage. That wealth is, theoretically, yours, but you have no voice in how it's used. You can't say, perhaps we shouldn't spend quite so much on horses this year. You can't suggest, maybe we should save more for our daughter's dowry. You certainly can't demand, I want an accounting of where my inheritance has gone. To do any of that would be to challenge your husband's authority. And a wife who challenged her husband's authority was, by definition, a bad wife, a disobedient wife, a wife who needed correction. But wait, you might be thinking, didn't you say women could inherit property? Yes, they could. And that's where this gets really interesting, because the wealthiest, most powerful women in medieval England were widows. When a husband died, his widow was entitled to her dower. That's different from dowry, by the way, and I know the words are confusingly similar. The dower was 1/3 of everything her husband had owned. 1/3 of the land, 1/3 of the income from that land, 1/3 of the property. This was hers for life. She couldn't pass it to her children. It would revert to her husband's estate after her death. But while she lived, it was hers to control. Do you see what this means? A woman had more economic power as a widow than she ever had as a wife. Death freed her. As long as her husband lived, she was under his control, silent about money, unable to make decisions. But the moment he died, she became a powerful landowner in her own right. She could make contracts, manage estates, negotiate marriages for her children. She had a voice, finally, and that made widows extremely attractive to ambitious men. If you were a young man in medieval England looking to climb the social ladder, your best bet wasn't to marry a young maiden with a modest dowry. No, your best bet was to marry a wealthy widow who came with lands already in her control. Widows knew this. Of course they knew they were being pursued for their property. But could they say that out loud? Could a widow bluntly tell a suitor, I know you're only interested in my dower lands? She could think it. She certainly knew it, but to say it would be crass, unladylike, would violate every rule of courtship and propriety. There's a woman I want you to meet. Her name was Alice Chaucer, Duchess of Suffolk, and she lived in the 15th century. Alice was married 3 times. Her first husband died when she was young. Her second husband was Thomas Montague, Earl of Salisbury. Yes, from the same Montague family that tried to marry Joan of Kent. Thomas died in battle, leaving Alice an extremely wealthy widow. She then married William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, one of the most powerful men in England. Throughout all of this, Alice accumulated property, managed estates, wielded significant political influence. But here's what fascinates me. We have records of her financial transactions. We have documents showing what she bought, what she sold, which estates she managed. We have letters she wrote negotiating deals, but we don't have records of her discussing any of this with her husbands. The public record shows a woman of considerable business acumen. The private record, the conversations at the dinner table, the pillow talk, the daily reality of managing money within marriage, that's completely silent. Because here's the thing medieval people understood but rarely stated. Money is power, and power in marriage was supposed to flow one direction only, from husband to wife, never the reverse. For a woman to openly acknowledge her wealth, to discuss her property rights, to negotiate the terms of her own financial life, that would be to claim power. and claiming power meant disrupting the entire social order. Let me paint you a picture of how this worked in practice. Imagine you're a noblewoman in 1300. Your father has just died, and you've inherited his estates. You're now one of the wealthiest women in your county, but you're married, so your husband controls those estates. One day you notice that your husband is selling off parcels of your inherited land to fund a war you think is foolish, a war you believe will bankrupt you both. Can you say, "Those are my lands, you cannot sell them"? Technically, legally, yes, they're yours, but practically, socially, no. Because to assert ownership would be to question his judgment, and a wife who questions her husband's judgment publicly is making him look weak, making him look controlled by a woman, and that's a humiliation no medieval man could tolerate. So you stay sant. You watch your inheritance disappear piece by piece. Maybe you write a letter to your brother, carefully worded, never directly criticizing your husband but hinting at concerns. Maybe you pray, maybe you cry in private, but you don't have the conversation that needs to happen. This is my property, and I should have a say in what happens to it. The most heartbreaking part. Many medieval women internalized this silence. They genuinely believed that their opinions about money didn't matter, that financial decisions were men's business, that their role was to accept whatever their husbands decided. It wasn't just that they couldn't speak, it's that they'd been taught not to want to speak. But some women resisted. Quietly, cleverly, they found ways to protect their assets. They'd negotiate agreements before marriage, setting aside certain properties that would remain under their sole control. They'd make gifts to the church, establishing religious foundations that secured income streams their husbands couldn't touch. They'd arrange strategic loans to friends or family, creating financial networks that existed outside their husband's authority. These were acts of silent rebellion, ways of saying, "This is mine," without ever speaking the words aloud. Joan of Kent, by the way, eventually got her first marriage to Thomas Holland recognised as valid. She fought for years, took her case all the way to the Pope, and won. Her marriage to William Montagu was annulled, and she was reunited with Thomas. But think about what that meant financially. William's family had received her dowry. They had spent years benefiting from her inherited lands. When the marriage was annulled, did they have to give everything back? The legal battles were enormous, and Joan couldn't fight them herself. She needed male relatives to argue on her behalf. She knew exactly what was at stake financially, but she couldn't be the one to say, "I want my money back." That had to come from men, her father, her brothers, eventually her husband Thomas. And here's something that might surprise you. Even queens faced this. Eleanor of Aquitaine, whom we met in the last chapter, was Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. She was one of the wealthiest people in Europe, male or female. When she married Louis VII of France, her lands made him far more powerful. When she divorced Louis and married Henry II of England, those same lands shifted the balance of power between France and England. Eleanor's property literally shaped European politics for decades. But could Eleanor sit in council meetings and say, "These are my lands, and here's how I think they should be governed"? Sometimes, yes. Eleanor was exceptional, powerful enough to occasionally break the rules. But even she faced limits. When her sons rebelled against their father Henry in 1173, Henry didn't just imprison his sons, he imprisoned Eleanor too, for 16 years. Why? Because her lands, her wealth, her political power made her dangerous. He couldn't divorce her, that would mean returning Aquitaine to her control. So he locked her away, and during those 16 years her lands generated wealth that Henry used, spent, gave away as he pleased. Eleanor, the rightful duchess, the owner of Aquitaine, had no say. She was wealthy beyond measure and completely powerless. That's the paradox we need to understand. Medieval women could be rich and silenced at the same time. They could own half a county and have no voice in how it was managed. They could be legally entitled to property and practically unable to protect it. Now you might wonder, did husbands ever talk to their wives about money? I'm sure some did. In lower-class marriages, where survival depended on both partners working, there must have been practical conversations about household economics. A peasant husband and wife probably discussed whether to sell the pig, whether they could afford seed for next year's planting, how to pay the Lord's fees. Poverty, ironically, might have required more financial honesty than wealth did. But for the nobility, for the wealthy merchant class, for anyone with significant property, those conversations happened elsewhere. Husbands consulted their stewards, their lawyers, their male relatives. Wives managed household expenses, the kitchen, the servants, the day-to-day running of the manor. But major financial decisions, those were made in rooms wives weren't invited into, discussed in conversations wives weren't part of, finalized in documents wives sometimes didn't even see until they were presented as fait accompli. And wives, for their part, weren't supposed to be curious about money. A well-bred woman was supposed to trust her husband's judgment, to assume he was managing everything wisely, to never ever ask, "How much did that cost?" or "Can we afford this?" or "What happens if you die? Will we be secure?" These questions implied doubt. They suggested the wife didn't have faith in her husband's competence, and that was unacceptable. So we return to silence. The silence of Eleanor and Robert from our last chapter, now married for years, still not discussing the one thing that governs so much of their life together: money. He knows she brought a substantial dowry. She knows he's spent portions of it. Neither can acknowledge this directly. He can't say, "Your father's lands have been very profitable this year." She can't ask, "What are we worth?" They live in a house built on financial transactions they cannot name, surrounded by wealth they cannot discuss. And when Robert dies, Eleanor will finally see the accounting. She'll discover what she owned, what was spent, what remains. She'll have her dower, 1/3 of everything, and suddenly she'll have the power to make decisions. But it will be too late to have the conversation she needed to have decades earlier. Too late to say, "I should have been part of these decisions." Too late to ask, "Why couldn't you trust me with the truth?" The money was always there, hovering over every meal, every argument, every moment of their marriage. But the words to talk about it, those were forbidden. We've explored the wedding night, where love couldn't be spoken. We've walked through the manor house, where money couldn't be discussed. But now we need to enter the most private chamber of all, the bedroom itself. Because if medieval couples couldn't talk about emotions and couldn't talk about finances, wait until you hear what they couldn't say about their bodies, about desire, about the intimate acts that the church regulated down to the smallest detail. That's where the silence became truly suffocating, and that's where we're going next. There's a document that exists from the early 13th century called the Summae Confessorum. It's a handbook, essentially, a guide for priests hearing confessions, and tucked within its pages is something remarkable, a detailed list of when married couples were forbidden from having sex. Not suggestions, not recommendations, forbidden. As in, if you broke these rules, you were sinning, and you'd need to confess it to a priest. Let me read you some of these prohibited times. No sex on Sundays, none on feast days, and there were a lot of feast days. No sex during Advent, the 4 weeks before Christmas. No sex during Lent, the 40 days before Easter. No sex on any fast days. No sex during menstruation. No sex during pregnancy. No sex while breastfeeding. No sex for 40 days after childbirth. Are you keeping track? Because historians have calculated that on average, a married couple following all these rules could legally have sex less than once a week, sometimes much less. Now, here's the question that haunts this entire conversation. Did medieval couples know all these rules? And if they knew them, could they talk about them? Imagine you're lying in bed with your spouse on a Saturday night. Tomorrow is Sunday. Forbidden. You know this. Does your husband know this? You think he does, but you're not certain. Do you say something? Do you whisper, "We cannot, it's nearly Sunday"? But to say that means acknowledging desire, acknowledging that you were considering the act, and women weren't supposed to desire sex. The church taught that sex was for procreation, not pleasure. A woman who wanted sex, who initiated it, who spoke openly about physical desire, that woman was dangerously close to being wanton, sinful, corrupted. So you stay silent, and maybe he reaches for you anyway. And now you face an impossible choice: refuse him and explain why, thus admitting you were thinking about sex and revealing that you know the rules perhaps too well, or submit and sin together in silence. Let me tell you about a story from Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, written in the 14th century. It's fiction, but fiction often reveals truths that official records hide. There's a tale about a man named Messer Ricciardo di Cinzica, an elderly scholar who marries a young, beautiful woman named Bartolomea. Ricciardo is obsessed with the church's rules about when couples can and cannot have sex. He keeps a religious calendar and informs his wife constantly, "Today is the feast of Saint So-and-so, we cannot. This week is dedicated to Saint such-and-such, we must abstain." He calculates that by the time you account for all the religious prohibitions, there are barely any days left in the year when sex is permitted. Bartolomea, young and full of life, grows increasingly frustrated. But can she say this is ridiculous? Can she argue these rules are making me miserable? Can she tell her husband, "I have needs that you're not meeting"? In Boccaccio's story, she eventually runs away with a pirate, which is obviously an extreme solution and, probably not historically common. But the underlying truth is there. The church's rules created situations where couples couldn't honestly discuss their intimate lives because doing so meant admitting to desires that weren't supposed to exist. The church's position was clear. Sex within marriage was permissible for one reason only: procreation, making babies, continuing the family line, fulfilling God's commandment to be fruitful and multiply. Pleasure? That was at best a side effect. At worst, it was sinful even within marriage. St. Augustine, whose writings heavily influenced medieval Christianity, taught that even married couples sinned if they enjoyed sex too much, if they sought it for pleasure rather than procreation. Think about what this means for marital conversation. A husband couldn't say to his wife, "I desire you." Not really. Not in a way that acknowledged physical pleasure as a good thing. He could say, in effect, "We should fulfill our marital duty," or "It's time to try for another child, but I want you because you're beautiful and I take pleasure in your body." That edged too close to lust, which was one of the 7 deadly sins. And a wife? Forget it. A wife expressing sexual desire was almost unthinkable. There were medical texts written by men, of course, that acknowledged women could experience pleasure during sex. In fact, there was a belief that female pleasure was necessary for conception, that a woman needed to reach a certain peak of excitement for pregnancy to occur. But this knowledge was clinical, discussed among physicians and theologians, not something a woman could articulate about her own body. There's a fascinating text called De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women, written in the late 13th or early 14th century. It's ostensibly a medical guide and it gives detailed instructions for sexual intercourse. It advises that a man should engage in foreplay, should fondle his wife's lower parts to raise her body temperature. They believed women's bodies needed to be heated to the right level for conception. The text says that when the wife begins to speak as if she were babbling, the husband should know she's ready. Babbling. The text describes female arousal as incoherent speech, as the breakdown of language. And here's the thing, this text was written for men. It was knowledge men were supposed to have about women's bodies. But were women supposed to read it? Were wives supposed to say to their husbands, "Actually, I need more preparation," or "That's not working for me"? No. This was secret knowledge about women that women themselves weren't supposed to voice. Can you imagine the frustration? You're a medieval wife, and your body has responses, needs, rhythms that you can feel but cannot name. Meanwhile, there's a whole medical literature about your body, about what you supposedly need, but it's written in Latin, discussed among male scholars, and never shared with you. And even if you somehow learn these things, you couldn't tell your husband, "According to De Secretis Mulierem, you're doing this wrong," without revealing that you'd been reading texts meant for men, that you'd been thinking about sex in a scholarly way, that you understood your own body better than a good Christian wife should. Let's talk about something even more specific. Positions. Yes, positions. The church had opinions about this too. The missionary position, man on top, woman beneath, was considered the only acceptable position for Christian intercourse. Why? Because it symbolized the proper hierarchy: man above, woman below, man active, woman passive. Any other position was considered unnatural and therefore sinful. But imagine you're a couple and that position is painful for the wife. Maybe she's pregnant or recovering from childbirth or simply finds it uncomfortable. Can she say, "Could we try differently"? To do so would be to suggest an alternative to the church-approved position, which means suggesting something potentially sinful. It would also mean taking an active role, making a request about sex, which violates the principle that women should be passive recipients, not active participants. So she endures pain in silence. Because the alternative, speaking up, negotiating, finding a solution together, would require a conversation that medieval marriage simply didn't allow. There were also rules about times of day. Sex was supposed to happen at night, in darkness, under the covers. The idea that a couple might see each other's bodies, might have sex in daylight, was considered immodest at best, perverted at worst. This wasn't just preference, this was doctrine. Married couples were expected to approach sex with solemnity, with their minds focused on procreation, not with joy or playfulness or visual pleasure. I want you to think about what this does to intimacy. Real intimacy requires communication. It requires being able to say, "This feels good," or "That hurts," or "Could we slow down," or "I'm not ready yet." It requires negotiation, adjustment, learning each other's bodies and responses. But all of that requires words. And medieval couples, especially women, simply didn't have those words available to them. There's another layer to this that's even more heartbreaking. The church taught that both spouses owed each other the marital debt. This is something I mentioned briefly before, but we need to understand it more deeply. The marital debt meant that either spouse could demand sex, and the other was obligated to comply. St. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians that husband and wife had power over each other's bodies, that neither should refuse the other except by mutual agreement for prayer. In theory, this sounds almost egalitarian. Both partners have equal rights to sex. But in practice, how do you think this played out? A husband could demand sex from his wife and she was obligated to comply. If she refused without a legitimate reason, pregnancy, menstruation, a religious fast day, she was sinning. But what counted as legitimate? Being tired, being sick, being emotionally distant, being afraid? Medieval law and theology didn't recognize marital rape. The concept didn't exist. Because if a wife was obligated to have sex on demand, then refusing was her sin, not his violation. She couldn't say, "I don't want to." She couldn't say, "Not tonight, I'm exhausted." She couldn't say, "You've been cruel to me today, and I don't want to be intimate with you right now." All of these were irrelevant. The marital debt superseded personal feelings, physical comfort, emotional connection. Now, could a wife demand sex from her husband? Technically, yes. The doctrine said both partners had equal rights. But can you imagine a medieval wife actually doing this? Walking up to her husband and saying, "I require you to fulfill your marital duty tonight." The social stigma would have been enormous. Women weren't supposed to want sex, remember? So a woman demanding it would be seen as unnatural, aggressive, possibly even possessed by demons or corrupted by lust. There are, however, some fascinating cases where wives did assert their rights under the marital debt doctrine. If a husband was impotent, unable to perform sexually, a wife could petition for an annulment on the grounds that the marriage couldn't be consummated. These cases are documented in church courts, and they're extraordinary. A wife would have to publicly testify that her husband couldn't fulfill his obligations. Sometimes, and I'm not making this up, the court would bring in expert witnesses, prostitutes usually, to test whether the man was truly impotent or just unable to perform with his wife. Can you imagine being the wife in that situation? You've taken the enormous risk of publicly stating that your husband is impotent. You've violated every rule about female modesty and silence. You've humiliated your husband before the community. And now you're waiting while a prostitute attempts to arouse him to prove whether you're telling the truth. The level of desperation required to take such a step tells us everything about how trapped women felt in marriages where even the most basic physical aspect wasn't working. But here's the twist. These cases existed because sex was considered so fundamental to marriage. The church taught that sex was sinful outside marriage, but necessary within it. Procreation was humanity's primary duty, so a marriage without sex was, in some ways, not a marriage at all. That's why impotence was grounds for annulment, not adultery, not cruelty, not incompatibility, but the inability to have sex. Yet despite sex being so central to marriage, couples still couldn't talk about it honestly. They couldn't say, "This isn't satisfying," or "We're not connecting physically," or "I need something different." They could only fulfill the obligation in silence, following rules they may not have fully understood, hoping they were pleasing God while suppressing any pleasure they might accidentally feel. There were couples who managed to navigate this, of course. There must have been husbands and wives who found wordless ways to communicate, who developed a physical language between them that didn't require speech. A touch here, a gesture there, a rhythm learned over years. But that's not the same as being able to say, "I love this," or "more of that," or "let's try something new." It's accommodation, adaptation, making do with senness when what you need is conversation. And the religious fasting days, the prohibited times, these would have been constant sources of tension. How many times did a couple want to be intimate, only to realize it was forbidden? How many times did desire meet doctrine and lose? The calendar governed their bodies, their beds, their most private moments, and they couldn't even complain about it, because to complain would be to admit that they wanted sex for reasons other than procreation, that they were motivated by pleasure or connection, or simple human need. I sometimes wonder what happened in the mornings after. Did couples ever acknowledge what had happened the night before? Did they discuss it over breakfast? Last night was nice. Seems like such a simple thing to say. But was it ever said? Or did medieval couples maintain silence about sex even in retrospect, treating each encounter as something that happened in a separate reality, never to be mentioned in daylight? The silence extended to problems too. If a wife experienced pain during sex, could she tell anyone? Perhaps a female friend, perhaps her mother if she was lucky. But a husband, the person who could actually do something about it, that conversation was almost impossible. And if a husband struggled with impotence or premature completion or any of the 1,000 things that can complicate physical intimacy, could he confess that to his wife? No. That would be admitting weakness, failure, inadequacy. So problems went unsolved, pain was endured, dissatisfaction was swallowed. And the marriage bed, which should have been a place of connection and vulnerability and mutual care, became instead another space of silence and obligation and carefully managed distance. We've traced the silences of medieval marriage from the wedding night through the counting house and now into the bedroom itself. We've seen how couples couldn't speak of love, couldn't discuss money, and couldn't negotiate the most intimate aspects of their shared life. But there's another silence we haven't explored yet, and it might be the most painful of all. Because if medieval couples couldn't talk about desire or pleasure, they also couldn't talk about the purpose of that desire, the children who were supposed to result from it. And when those children were daughters instead of sons, when the prayers for a male heir went unanswered year after year, the silence in those bedrooms grew so heavy it could suffocate. That's where we're heading next. Into the unspoken desperation for sons and the things no one could say about daughters. Something strange happens when you read medieval literature. You find these soaring, passionate love stories, knights risking everything for their ladies, lovers exchanging tender words and secret glances, poetry that makes your heart ache with longing. And then you realize almost none of these love stories are about married people loving each other. They're about adultery, they're about impossible love, they're about desire that exists precisely because it cannot be fulfilled within marriage. The word love in the Middle Ages was dangerous, not because people didn't feel it, they absolutely did, but because speaking it in the context of marriage was almost transgressive. It confused categories. It mixed up what was supposed to be separate. Marriage was duty, obligation, sacrament, property arrangement. Love was passion, choice, poetry, madness, and the two were not supposed to meet. There's a proverb from the medieval period that perfectly captures this contradiction. That which the heart thinks, the mouth speaks. It sounds romantic, doesn't it? Like an encouragement to be honest, to express your feelings. But in the context of marriage, it was actually a warning. It meant be careful what your heart thinks, because if you think it deeply enough, you might accidentally speak it. And if you speak love to your spouse, people might wonder what kind of marriage you really have. Let me take you to southern France in the 12th century, to the courts of Aquitaine and Provence, where something extraordinary was happening. Poets called troubadours were creating a new kind of literature, courtly love poetry. These were songs and verses celebrating refined, noble, passionate love. They described lovers who would do anything for each other, who elevated each other, who saw each other as the center of the universe. It was beautiful, it was revolutionary, and it was explicitly, intentionally about love outside of marriage. The rules of courtly love were actually written down by a writer named Andreas Capellanus in a text called The Art of Courtly Love, written around 1186. And one of the rules, stated plainly, was that true love cannot exist between husband and wife. Marriage, Andreas wrote, involves obligation, and love must be freely given. Therefore, by definition, married people cannot truly love each other in the courtly sense. They might have affection, companionship, respect. But love, real love, that was for someone else's wife or someone else's husband or someone completely unattainable. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds insane. Why would medieval culture create an entire literary tradition celebrating love, then declare it incompatible with marriage? But here's the thing. It makes perfect sense within their worldview. Marriage was too important to be about something as unstable as love. Marriage held society together. It transferred property, created alliances, produced heirs, maintained order. You couldn't build civilization on something as unpredictable as human emotion. So love had to be kept separate, channeled into art and literature and fantasy, kept safely away from the practical business of marriage. But people being people, some of them fell in love anyway, even with their own spouses, and when they did, they faced a peculiar problem. They had no language for it. Let me tell you about Edward IV of England. In 1464, Edward was a young king, handsome and charming, expected to make a brilliant political marriage. His advisors were negotiating with foreign powers, looking for a princess who could bring alliances and wealth. And then Edward did something shocking. He married for love. He married a widow named Elizabeth Woodville, a woman with no great political connections, no foreign alliance to offer, nothing but herself. And he married her secretly. When the marriage was revealed, it was scandalous. Not because Elizabeth was inappropriate. She was from a respectable family, gentle-born if not royal. But because Edward had chosen her for love, he'd put personal desire ahead of political necessity. He'd confused the categories, and his nobles never quite forgave him for it. They couldn't say he loves his wife as though it were a good thing. Instead, they said he's bewitched, or he's thinking with his loins, not his head, or he's forgotten his duty. The language for a king loving his queen simply didn't exist in a positive form. Now imagine being Elizabeth in this situation. She loves her husband. He clearly loves her. He gave up political advantage to marry her. But can she say it? Can she walk up to him and say, "I love you"? Maybe in private, in whispered moments. But in public, in front of the court, that would be drawing attention to the very thing that made their marriage controversial. It would be admitting that their relationship was based on feeling rather than duty. So Elizabeth had to love her husband in sense, or at least in carefully modulated terms. She could say "my lord" and "my king" and show respect and deference. But "my love," that was risky territory. Here's where class comes into this in a really interesting way. Among peasants and common folk, there was actually more freedom to love. If you were a blacksmith marrying a baker's daughter, no one really cared why you married. There were no political alliances to consider, no vast estates to unite. You married because you needed a partner to work alongside to share the burden of survival. And if you happened to like each other, if affection grew into love, well, that was between you and God. Poor people could love their spouses without causing scandal because their marriages didn't matter enough to anyone else. But the higher you went in society, the more constrained you became. A merchant might need to be careful. Marriages in the merchant class often involved business partnerships, and love could complicate those. But nobility, royalty, for them love in marriage was almost an embarrassment, a sign that they'd lost sight of what marriage was really for. There's a beautiful tragic example from Provence. A noble woman named Marjorie Paston, we have some of her letters preserved, fell in love with her family's bailiff, a man named Richard Cal. Richard was respectable, competent, good at his work, but he was employed by the family. He was not Marjorie's social equal, and Marjorie's mother was absolutely determined that Marjorie would marry someone appropriate, someone who could advance the family's position. But Marjorie and Richard loved each other, and they did something extraordinary. They married in secret, without the family's permission. When the family found out, they were furious. They tried to have the marriage annulled. They brought Marjorie before the bishop to prove that the marriage wasn't valid. And here's what's heartbreaking. We have a letter Richard wrote to Marjorie during this time. He calls her "my own lady and mistress, and before God my very true wife." You can feel his love, his devotion, his desperation in every word. This is real love, the kind poets write about. But Marjorie's family couldn't see it that way. They couldn't say, "Our daughter has found love." Instead, they said, She's been seduced. She's disgraced us. She's forgotten her duty. Love, when it disrupted social order, became the enemy. And even though the church eventually upheld the marriage because consent and consummation made it valid, regardless of the family's wishes, Marjorie was essentially disowned. Her mother refused to see her. Her family cut her off. The price of speaking love, of acting on love, of choosing love over duty, was exile from everything she'd known. Now let's talk about what happened inside marriages where love did develop over time, because it did happen. Couples who started as strangers sometimes became genuine partners, friends, even lovers. But how did they express it? What words could they use? They couldn't use the language of courtly love. That was for illicit passion, not marital affection. They couldn't be too effusive, too emotional, because that suggested instability, a lack of proper control. They found other words. A husband might say his wife was a good manager of the household, or a virtuous mother to our children. A wife might say her husband was a good provider, or a just lord. These sound cold to us, don't they? But within the constraints of medieval marriage, they were the closest many people could come to saying, "I love you." There are some letters between married couples that survive, and they're fascinating. A husband writing to his wife about business matters will suddenly include a line like, "I commend me to you with all my heart." That phrase, "with all my heart," that was code. It meant more than the formal greeting that surrounded it. It was a way of saying, "I care about you," without actually saying it. Or a wife writing to her husband away at war might close with, "I pray daily for your safe return." That doesn't sound like much, but in a world where expressing emotion was constrained, where admitting you needed someone was a vulnerability, "I pray for you" was a profound statement. It meant you matter to me, your absence causes me pain, I want you back. All of that compressed into an acceptable religious formula. But here's what kills me. These couples couldn't just say what they meant. They had to encode it, disguise it, wrap it in acceptable language. And that meant they could never be entirely sure they were understood. When a husband wrote, "I commend me to you," did his wife understand that he was trying to say he loved her? Or did she read it as mere formality? When a wife prayed for her husband's return, did he know it was because she missed him? Or did he think she was just being pious? The language of love requires directness to work properly. "I love you" means nothing if you can't actually say those words. If you have to hint and imply and hope the other person decodes your meaning correctly. And medieval marriage didn't allow for that directness. There's a concept in courtly love literature called fine amours, refined love. It described a love so pure, so elevated, that it made you a better person. The lover strove to be worthy of his beloved, to elevate himself through his devotion to her. It's a beautiful ideal, but it was supposed to happen outside marriage. A knight could have fine amours for a lady who was not his wife. He would dedicate his deeds to her, wear her colours in tournaments, write poetry in her honour, and all of this was considered noble and good, as long as it remained unconsummated, as long as it stayed in the realm of impossible longing. But what if you felt that way about your own wife? What if marriage, despite all its constraints, had produced genuine love, and you wanted to honour your wife the way knights honoured their ladies? You couldn't. Because doing so would be confusing the categories again. It would be suggesting that your wife was your beloved, your inspiration, your heart's desire. And wives weren't supposed to be those things. Wives were helpmeets, companions, bearers of children. Beloved ladies were distant, unattainable, perfect. The roles didn't overlap, so men who loved their wives had to hide it behind duty. They had to say, "I provide for her," when what they meant was, "I would die for her." They had to say, "She manages my household well," when what they meant was, she makes my life worth living. The love was there, but it had to disguise itself as something more acceptable. And women who loved their husbands, they had even fewer options. A woman wasn't supposed to write poetry to her husband. She wasn't supposed to dedicate deeds to him. She didn't perform deeds, she was kept at home. She wasn't supposed to express passionate devotion because passionate devotion in a woman looked like either spiritual ecstasy, which was appropriate only for religious life, or sexual wantonness, which was sinful. So women who loved their husbands expressed it through actions, through care, through loyalty, through the daily, invisible labour of maintaining a household and a life. But the words weren't available. There's a poem from the medieval period, author unknown, that captures this perfectly. It's called The Wife's Lament, and it's one of the few surviving pieces of literature that seems to be written from a woman's perspective. The speaker is separated from her husband by distance, by circumstances that aren't entirely clear, and she mourns. She talks about her longing, her sorrow, her sense of being incomplete without him. But even in this poem, she never says, I love him. She says she's exiled from her Lord. She talks about their joy together. She describes her pain. But the word love, it's not there. Because even in poetry, even in private lamentation, the word was too dangerous, too revealing, too close to the courtly love that wasn't supposed to happen in marriage. Now some of you might be thinking, surely some people broke these rules. Surely some husbands and wives looked at each other and said, forget propriety, I love you. And yes, that probably happened. In private moments, in whispers, in the safety of their own chambers, some couples must have spoken the forbidden words. But we don't have records of those moments because those moments were meant to be secret, were meant to be protected from the judging eyes of society. What we have instead are the public records, the letters written with the knowledge that others might read them, the legal documents, the observations of chroniclers. And in those public spaces, love between spouses is almost invisible. It's hidden behind duty, behind role, behind the acceptable languages of lordship and service. Catherine of Valois is a name worth knowing. She was the widow of Henry V of England. Henry died young, leaving Catherine with an infant son who had become King Henry VI. According to English law, Catherine couldn't remarry without permission from the King's Council, which meant she couldn't remarry until her son came of age, which might be decades away. Catherine was young, beautiful, lonely, and she fell in love with a Welsh soldier named Owen Tudor. So Catherine and Owen married in secret. They had children together. The Tudor dynasty that would eventually produce Henry VIII started with this secret love match. But Catherine could never publicly say, "This is my husband," or "I love this man." To do so would be to violate the law, to risk Owen's life, to potentially disinherit her children. So she loved in secret, spoke her love only in the privacy of her chamber, and to the world pretended Owen was merely a servant in her household. When Catherine died, Owen was arrested. The government considered their marriage scandalous, possibly even treasonous. And Owen's defense was simple. We were married. We loved each other. We did nothing wrong. But love wasn't a defense. Love didn't matter. What mattered was that Catherine had defied social order by choosing love over duty. The pattern repeats over and over in medieval history. Love exists, love happens, but it's not allowed to speak its name within marriage. It has to hide, disguise itself, pretend to be something else. And that silence, that inability to simply say "I love you" to the person you're legally bound to for life, that created a kind of loneliness even in togetherness. Think about growing old with someone. 20 years, 30 years, 40 years of marriage. You've raised children together, weathered crises together, built a life together, and somewhere along the way, despite everything, you've come to love this person. They're not just your spouse, they're your friend, your confidant, the person you want to see at the end of a long day, but you've never told them because the language isn't there, because love isn't what marriage is supposed to be about, because speaking it might reveal something dangerous about the nature of your bond. So you go to your grave having never said the words, and they go to theirs having never heard them, and maybe they knew anyway. Maybe love was understood in the space between words, in the gentle touches and quiet care. Or maybe they never knew. Maybe they lived their entire life together, wondering if they mattered, if they were valued beyond their utility, if they were loved. That's the tragedy of the dangerous word. Not that medieval people couldn't feel love. They could and did, but that they couldn't speak it, couldn't celebrate it, couldn't build their marriages on it openly and honestly. Love had to be a secret even between the two people experiencing it. We've journeyed now through layers of silence, the silence of strangers on a wedding night, the silence around money and property, the silence enforced by church rules in the bedroom, and now the silence around the most fundamental human emotion. But there's more, because medieval marriage involved something more complex than the inability to express positive feelings. It also involved an obligation so absolute, so non-negotiable that it crushed the possibility of consent itself. The next silence we need to explore is perhaps the darkest, the silence of refusal, the word no that could never be spoken, the conversations about desire and consent that were impossible by design. That's where we must go next, difficult as it may be, because understanding medieval marriage means understanding all of it, the loneliness, the love, and the coercion. We need to have a difficult conversation. I've mentioned the marital debt several times already, this idea that husband and wife owed each other sexual access, that both had rights to each other's bodies. On the surface, it sounds almost progressive for the medieval period. Equal rights, equal obligations, but when we dig into what this actually meant in practice, when we understand what words were made impossible by this doctrine, we find ourselves facing something deeply troubling. The word no didn't really exist within medieval marriage, not in the way we understand it. And tonight, we need to understand why and what that silence cost. Let's start with what the church actually taught. St. Paul wrote in his first letter to the Corinthians, "The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does." Read one way, this sounds almost radical for the first century. Both partners have claims on each other. Neither owns their own body exclusively. It's reciprocal. But read another way, the way medieval people understood it. It meant that refusing your spouse was a sin, a serious sin, one you'd need to confess to a priest. And if you refused repeatedly, you could face church punishment, social ostracism, even legal consequences. The theology was clear. Marriage created an obligation. Once you said "I do," once you consummated the union, your body was no longer entirely yours to control. Your spouse had rights to it. And those rights superseded your own desires, your own comfort, your own will. Now, here's where this gets complicated. Medieval theologians did acknowledge some legitimate reasons for refusing sex. If it was a forbidden day on the church calendar, and we talked about how many of those there were, if the wife was menstruating, pregnant in late stages, or in the 40 days after childbirth, if either spouse had taken a vow of chastity, which some married couples did later in life. These were acceptable reasons, but notice what's not on that list. I'm not in the mood. I'm angry with you. I'm tired. I don't want to. You've hurt me and I don't feel heyo. None of these were considered legitimate. So what could a medieval wife not say? She couldn't say, "Not tonight. I'm exhausted from managing the household all day." She couldn't say, "You were cruel to me this morning and I need time before I can be intimate with you." She couldn't say, "I'm still recovering from the last childbirth and I'm afraid." Well, she could say these things, but they weren't valid reasons to refuse. If her husband insisted, she was obligated to comply, and if she didn't, she was the one sinning. Let me tell you about a case that was recorded in a church court in York, England in the 14th century. A woman, her name is partially lost to history, but we'll call her Margaret, brought a complaint against her husband. Not for demanding sex, which wouldn't have been a complaint the court would hear. No, Margaret was complaining that her husband was impotent, that he couldn't fulfill his marital obligations, and she wanted an annulment on those grounds. The court investigated. They questioned Margaret extensively about her husband's attempts and failures. They brought in medical experts, such as they were in the 14th century, and eventually they ruled that the husband was indeed incapable of consummation and the marriage could be annulled. Margaret was free to remarry. But here's what struck me when I read this case. Margaret had to prove her husband couldn't have sex with her. She had to demonstrate that she'd been denied her marital rights. But nowhere in the record does anyone ask Margaret if she wanted those rights. Nowhere does anyone say, "Did you desire your husband? Were you disappointed by his impotence?" The assumption was simply that of course she wanted sex, because sex was the purpose of marriage. Her feelings about it, whether she was relieved or disappointed or indifferent, were irrelevant. This is the paradox at the heart of marital debt doctrine. It gave women a legal right to demand sex from their husbands. In theory, this was empowering. If your husband was neglecting you, if he was spending his attentions elsewhere, you could insist on your rights. But in practice, most women never used this right, because doing so would mean admitting to sexual desire, which was deeply transgressive for medieval women. So the equal doctrine actually protected men's access to their wives' bodies while doing very little to protect women's access to their husbands. There's another case, this one from France in the 13th century. A nobleman, we'll call him Guillaume, was accused by his wife of being unable to consummate their marriage. Guillaume insisted he was perfectly capable, just not with her. He claimed he could perform with other women, just not his wife. So the court, and I mentioned this briefly before, but we need to sit with how bizarre this is. The court arranged for a prostitute to attempt to arouse Guillaume, while observers watched to see if he could indeed perform. Can you imagine being the wife in this scenario? You've taken the enormous risk of publicly declaring your husband impotent. You've violated every rule of feminine modesty, and now you're waiting while strangers verify whether your husband can achieve an erection with a prostitute. What could she not say during this process? She couldn't say, "This is humiliating." She couldn't say, "Maybe the problem is that he's cruel to me and I don't want him anyway." She couldn't say, "I'd rather just end this marriage and live in peace." All she could do was pursue the one avenue available to her, proving the marriage hadn't been consummated and therefore wasn't valid. Guillaume, by the way, failed the test. The marriage was annulled. But what interests me is how the case was framed. It was never about whether the wife wanted to stay married, or whether the relationship was healthy, or whether both parties were happy. It was purely mechanical. Could this marriage produce children or not? And if not, it could be dissolved. But a marriage where the husband regularly forced himself on an unwilling wife, that was fine. That was normal. That was him exercising his marital rights. Now let's talk about what medieval people understood about desire and arousal, because this matters. Medieval medical texts acknowledged that women could experience pleasure during sex. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, there was a widespread belief that female pleasure was necessary for conception. They thought that women needed to reach a certain level of arousal for pregnancy to occur. This wasn't accurate biology, obviously, but it was what they believed. But here's the contradiction. Even though they believed female pleasure aided conception, And even though procreation was the stated goal of marital sex, husbands were not actually obligated to provide that pleasure. The marital debt meant a husband had to have sex with his wife if she demanded it, but it didn't mean he had to make sure she enjoyed it. And a wife certainly couldn't say, "You're not doing this right," or "I need more time," or "This hurts." To say any of that would be to admit she was paying attention to her own pleasure, which was dangerously close to lust. So we have this strange situation where everyone acknowledged that women could feel pleasure, where medical theory said that pleasure aided conception, but where actual women couldn't advocate for their own arousal or enjoyment without risking moral condemnation. There's a manual for confessors, priests who heard confessions, that survives from the 15th century. It gives priests guidance on what questions to ask penitents about sexual sins. And for married people, the manual tells priests to ask things like, "Did you have sex on a forbidden day? Did you use positions other than the approved one? Did you attempt to prevent conception?" But nowhere does it say, "Did you force your spouse?" Nowhere does it ask, "Did you continue when your spouse was in pain?" Because the concept of marital rape didn't exist. If you were married, consent was assumed to be permanent and ongoing. You consented once at the wedding, and that consent covered every sexual encounter for the rest of your married life. This is what medieval wives could never say. "I consented to marriage, but I don't consent to this particular act at this particular moment under these particular circumstances." The grammar of consent didn't allow for that kind of specificity. It was all or nothing. And once you'd said yes to marriage, saying no to sex wasn't really an option. But what about men? Could a husband refuse his wife? Theoretically, yes, the doctrine was reciprocal. But let's be realistic about how this would have played out. If a wife approached her husband and demanded her marital rights, and he refused, what would happen? He'd be violating church law, yes, but would anyone actually punish him? Would he face the same social censure a refusing wife would face? Probably not. Because there was this underlying assumption that men always wanted that sex, that male desire was constant and readily available, and therefore that a man refusing his wife must have a good reason. Maybe he was ill. Maybe he was exhausted from travel or battle. Maybe he was trying to live a more pious life. Whatever the reason, people would find a way to excuse it. But a wife refusing her husband? That was interpreted as willful disobedience, as a challenge to his authority, as evidence of her sinful nature. The same act, refusal, meant something entirely different depending on who did it. There's a story from the margins of history that I find haunting. It's not from a grand chronicle or a famous family, but from a village court record in England, probably early 14th century. A woman had left her husband and was living with her parents. The husband wanted her back and brought a case to the church court. The wife's defense was simply this: "He beats me and I fear for my life." The court's response: they ordered her to return to her husband, but they also warned the husband that he should treat her reasonably and not abuse her without cause. Without cause. As if there's a version of spousal abuse that's justified, that has cause. And what constituted reasonable treatment? What constituted cause for correction? The court didn't specify. It was left to the husband's judgment. The woman, her name isn't even recorded in a way I can decipher, had to go back. And she couldn't say, "I don't consent to this marriage anymore." She couldn't say, "I want out." She couldn't even say, "I'll stay married, but I want to live separately." She had to return to the home where she'd been beaten, to the man who'd harmed her, because she'd consented to the marriage, and that consent was irrevocable. And here's the darkest part. When she went back, she still owed him the marital debt. She still had to have sex with him on demand, because being afraid of your husband wasn't a valid reason to refuse. Being hurt by your husband wasn't a valid reason to refuse. Only the approved exceptions, menstruation, pregnancy, church fast days, those were valid. Everything else was irrelevant. How many medieval women do you think lay in bed beside men who'd hurt them, men who'd ignored their pleas, men who treated them as property, and couldn't say the simple word no? How many swallowed that word night after night, year after year, because speaking it would only make things worse, would bring church punishment and social shame on top of whatever private suffering they already endured? Now, I want to be clear about something. Not all medieval marriages were abusive. Many couples probably negotiated their intimate lives with kindness and consideration. Many husbands probably respected their wives' unspoken signals, backed off when they sensed reluctance, approached intimacy with gentleness. Many wives probably felt safe enough to indicate their needs in subtle ways, and their husbands understood. The marital debt doctrine was the official teaching, but human relationships are always more complex than official teachings. But the doctrine itself, the theological and legal framework, created a situation where genuine consent couldn't exist because refusal wasn't permitted. And when refusal isn't permitted, consent becomes meaningless. It's just compliance dressed up in sacramental language. There were some theologians who pushed back on the harsher interpretations of marital debt. In the 13th century, a few scholars suggested that if a wife was seriously ill, or if continuing sex would endanger her life, the husband should show mercy and restraint. But notice, these were framed as the husband choosing to be merciful, not as the wife having a right to refuse. Her well-being depended on his kindness, not on any inherent right she had to her own body. And there's something else we need to talk about: childbirth. Medieval childbirth was dangerous, really dangerous. Women died in childbirth all the time. It was the leading cause of death for women of childbearing age. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death, and yet women couldn't say, "I don't want to risk another pregnancy." They couldn't refuse sex to avoid pregnancy. They couldn't use birth control. That was a sin. They couldn't even space their children by avoiding sex during fertile times, because figuring out fertile times was considered a form of contraception and therefore sinful. So a woman could have survived 5 difficult births, could know that another pregnancy might kill her, could be terrified every time her husband approached her, and she still couldn't say no. She couldn't say, "My body can't take another pregnancy." She couldn't say, "I'm willing to risk damnation to use birth control." She couldn't even say, "Let's just avoid sex during the times I'm most likely to conceive." All of these options were closed to her. Her only hope was that her husband would show restraint voluntarily, or that God would decide not to give her another child, or that she'd survive if he did. Think about the prayer a medieval woman might have said, "Please, God, let me not conceive." But she couldn't say that prayer out loud, couldn't share it with anyone, because it revealed that she didn't want more children, which meant she was rejecting God's plan for marriage. So even her prayers had to be a secret, whispered into the dark where no one could hear. There's a concept in some medieval texts, mostly written by monks, interestingly, about married couples who took mutual vows of chastity. These were couples who decided together to stop having sex and live as brother and sister in Christ. This was considered highly virtuous, a sign of spiritual advancement, and it was one of the only ways out of the marital debt obligation. If both spouses agreed to celibacy, they could escape the cycle of demand and compliance. But notice, both had to agree. One spouse couldn't unilaterally decide to be celibate, and in practice this option was usually only taken by older couples whose children were grown, or by couples where the wife was past childbearing age. A young wife couldn't say, "I want us to be celibate," because that would be denying her husband his rights. And even if she wanted to suggest it, how could she? To bring it up would be to admit she didn't want sex, which would be admitting to a failure of wifely duty. So we return again and again to silence. The silence of women who couldn't say no. The silence of women who couldn't express fear or pain or exhaustion. The silence of women whose consent to marriage was transformed into a lifetime of compliance with no option to withdraw, no right to refuse, no language to express the difference between willing participation and resigned submission. And yes, some medieval men were probably trapped in their own silences too. A husband who didn't want sex as often as he thought he should, who was tired or anxious or simply not interested, couldn't admit that without seeming less masculine. A husband who wanted emotional connection rather than just physical release couldn't say that without appearing weak. The marital debt trapped men too, but in different ways, in softer cages. But for women, the cage was steel. For women, the inability to say no was enforced by church, by law, by society, by the threat of punishment both eternal and immediate. And that silence, that absence of the word no, shaped everything else about medieval marriage. We've walked through so many silences now. We've seen couples who couldn't speak love, couldn't discuss money, couldn't negotiate their intimate lives, and now we've seen wives who couldn't refuse, couldn't protect themselves, couldn't claim ownership of their own bodies. But there's another silence waiting for us, one that's perhaps even more pervasive because it affected every single moment of a medieval woman's life. We haven't yet talked about anger, about the emotions women were absolutely forbidden to express, about the rage that had to be swallowed daily, about the ways women found to speak what could not be spoken. That's where our story goes next, into the dangerous territory of female anger, in a world that demanded perfect silent submission. Anger was one of the 7 deadly sins. Pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, sloth, and anger. These were the sins that could damn your soul to hell. And for medieval women, anger wasn't just sinful. It was proof of their fundamental nature, evidence of their weakness, confirmation that women were spiritually and morally inferior to men. Because while men could be angry, righteously, justly, appropriately, women's anger was always excessive, always unreasonable, always a sign of their inability to control their base emotions. So what could a medieval wife not say? I'm angry with you. Those 4 simple words were essentially forbidden, because to express anger was to violate the most basic rule of femininity, that women should be gentle, submissive, patient, and above all silent in the face of mistreatment. Let me take you inside a real medieval household manual. It's called The Good Wife's Guide, written in France in the 14th century by an elderly husband for his young wife. It's meant to be instructive, kind even. The husband genuinely seems to want to help his wife succeed in her role. And here's what he tells her about speaking to her husband. Be silent, or at least speak sparingly and wisely so as to protect and conceal your husband's secrets. Do not be arrogant or answer back to your future husband or to his words, and do not contradict him, especially in front of others. Do not answer back, do not contradict, be silent. This wasn't advice from a cruel man. This was standard instruction for a good wife. And notice what's being asked. Not just to avoid expressing anger, but to actively protect her husband even when he's wrong, even when he's mistreating her. A good wife's job was to absorb her husband's mistakes, his cruelties, his failures, and never, ever reflect them back to him in the form of criticism or complaint. But women felt anger. Of course they did. They were human beings facing frustration, injustice, betrayal, exhaustion. So what happened to that anger when it couldn't be spoken? Let me tell you about a woman named Alessandra Strozzi. She lived in Florence in the 15th century, and we have dozens of her letters preserved. Alessandra was a widow, And remember, widows had more freedom to express themselves than wives did. After her husband died, she chose not to remarry specifically so she could maintain control over her sons' lives and fortunes. And her letters are fascinating because you can see her anger flickering through the polite language. She's writing to her sons, who are living in other cities, conducting business, and she's furious with them. They're not following her advice, they're not marrying the women she's selected, they're not managing money the way she thinks they should. But she can't just say, "I'm angry with you, you're being foolish." That would be too direct, too harsh, would violate the expectations of feminine communication. So instead, she writes things like, "Not seeing any children of yours makes me wonder who are they doing all this work for? If they carry on as they are, they will harden their hearts and they'll keep me in these negotiations for so long that I'll die." Do you hear the anger underneath that? She's essentially saying, "You're disappointing me so much it's going to kill me." But she has to frame it as sorrowful worry rather than righteous fury. She has to make her anger sound like sadness. Make her criticism sound like concern. Because angry women weren't just unpleasant, they were sinful. And Alessandra was a widow, which gave her more latitude than a wife would have. Can you imagine a wife writing that kind of letter to her husband? Even in that indirect, softened form? Number. Because a wife criticizing her husband even gently, even through the language of worry, would be overstepping her bounds. There's another remarkable woman whose voice has come down to us, Christine de Pizan. She was a writer in late 14th century France, one of the first women in Europe to earn a living by her writing. Christine lost her husband young, and like Alessandra chose not to remarry so she could maintain her independence. And Christine wrote extensively about women's experiences, about the injustices women faced, about the ways society constrained and diminished them. In one of her works, she describes the advice given to young wives. She says that women are told to endure everything with patience, to never complain, to accept mistreatment as God's will. And you can feel Christine's anger at this teaching, but even she, a professional writer, a widow with independence, even she has to be careful how she expresses it. She frames it as observation rather than criticism, as reporting rather than protesting. Because female anger, even in a book, even in fiction, was dangerous. But the most fascinating evidence of women's suppressed anger comes from an unexpected source: embroidery. Yes, embroidery. That most feminine, most gentle, most acceptable of women's activities. Because when women couldn't speak their anger, some of them stitched it instead. There's a famous example, Mary, Queen of Scots. When she was imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth I of England, Mary spent years under house arrest, closely watched, her letters censored, her every word scrutinized for signs of treason or plotting. And during those years, Mary embroidered. She created elaborate needlework panels, some of which still survive, and hidden in those stitches were messages. One panel shows a cat watching a mouse. The cat wears a crown, that's Elizabeth. The mouse is Mary herself, trapped, watched, unable to escape. Another panel shows a phoenix rising from flames with the motto, "From my ashes I will rise." These aren't gentle, submissive images. These are expressions of defiance, resistance, anger. But they're encoded in thread and fabric in a form that looked like harmless feminine craft. Mary couldn't say to her jailers, "I despise this captivity, I just rage against your queen," but she could stitch it. And some of her contemporaries who saw the embroidery would have understood. Think about the control required to express anger through needlework. You're furious, you're desperate, you're trapped, and your only outlet is to spend hours painstakingly stitching symbols that might convey your feelings to those clever enough to decode them. It's anger compressed into art, rage transformed into beauty, and it's heartbreaking. But most women weren't queens. Most women didn't have the education or the materials to create elaborate symbolic embroidery. Most women's anger just had to be swallowed. Day after day, year after year, decade after decade. And that kind of suppression does things to a person. Medieval medical texts, again written by men, described a condition they called suffocation of the womb, or sometimes hysteria, from the Greek word for womb. They believed that women who didn't have regular sex or who suppressed their emotions too much would develop physical symptoms, breathing problems, fainting, pain, irrational behavior. The treatment? Usually sex or sometimes marriage if the woman was unmarried. They literally thought that women's bodies would rebel if emotions weren't properly released. Now we know this wasn't accurate medicine, but what's interesting is that medieval doctors recognized that emotional suppression created physical symptoms. They just blamed it on women's inherently weak and unstable nature, rather than on the social conditions that forced women to suppress everything they felt. And here's something that might surprise you. Religious women, nuns, anchoresses, holy women, they were allowed to express emotion in ways that lay women weren't. In fact, extreme emotion was seen as a sign of their holiness. Medieval religious texts are full of accounts of holy women weeping uncontrollably, crying out in spiritual ecstasy, experiencing visions that made them shake and moan and lose consciousness. This was considered evidence of their direct connection to God. But a married woman doing the same thing? She'd be considered mad, possessed, dangerous. The same behaviors that proved holiness in a nun proved instability in a wife. Because religious women's emotions were directed at God, which was acceptable, while married women's emotions might be directed at their earthly circumstances, at their husbands, at the injustices they experienced, and that was threatening. So if you were a medieval woman feeling intense anger, your options were limited. You could join a convent and channel that intensity into religious devotion, where it might be seen as holy passion. Or you could suppress it, hide it, transform it into something acceptable. But you couldn't just be angry. You couldn't just say, "This is wrong, I'm furious, something needs to change." There's a letter that survived from the 13th century, written by a woman named Aline le Despencer, Countess of Norfolk. Aline was writing to the Chancellor of England about a legal matter affecting her family, and the letter is a masterpiece of controlled communication. She uses language typically reserved for men writing to each other. Dear friendship, formal legal terminology, carefully constructed arguments. She's assertive without being aggressive, firm without being harsh. She gets what she wants without ever appearing angry or demanding. Scholars who study this letter call it brilliant, and it is, but think about the skill required to write like that. Aline had to be so careful, so controlled, had to thread the needle perfectly between too submissive and too assertive. One wrong word and her letter would have been dismissed as emotional, hysterical, the ranting of a woman who didn't know her place. So she couldn't afford anger. She had to present her case as though she were a man, rational, measured, emotionally neutral, even though she was fighting for her family's survival and probably felt anything but neutral. Now, let's think about what this meant in daily life. Imagine you're a medieval wife. Your husband makes a decision about your children's future that you think is wrong. Maybe he's arranging a marriage for your daughter that you know will be unhappy. Maybe he's sending your son to train with a master you don't trust. You have legitimate concerns, good reasons to object. But you can't say, "This makes me angry." You can't say, "I disagree with this choice." You certainly can't say, "You're making a mistake." So what can you say? You can express worry. You can frame your concerns as feminine anxiety, as a mother's tender fears. You can say things like, "My lord, I'm sure you know best, but I wonder if you've considered." You can make your disagreement sound like timid questioning rather than confident opposition. And maybe, if you're skilled enough, if you choose your words carefully enough, if your husband is reasonable enough, he'll listen. But you can't be angry about it. Anger would end the conversation before it began. And if he doesn't listen, if he goes ahead with the plan you think is wrong, you have to accept it. With a smile, with grace, without resentment. Because showing resentment would be showing anger. And showing anger would be revealing that you thought your judgment was better than his, which would be pride, which would be sin. The psychological toll of this must have been enormous. Anger is a natural human emotion. It's how we respond to injustice, to boundary violations, to being harmed. Anger is protective. It tells us when something is wrong and gives us energy to fix it. But medieval women were taught that their anger was always wrong, always a sign of their moral failure, always evidence of their need for correction and control, so they internalized the message. They learned to doubt their own perceptions. When something made them angry, they'd ask themselves, am I being unreasonable? Is this my female weakness showing? Am I failing to be patient and submissive as I should be? They gaslit themselves because society had taught them that their anger couldn't be trusted. There's a quote from the period that captures this perfectly. Lucrezia de' Medici, sister of Lorenzo de' Medici, the ruler of Florence, wrote in a letter, "Don't be born a woman if you want your own way." She was 13 when she was betrothed, 18 when she married, and by the time she wrote that letter, she'd learned the fundamental lesson of medieval womanhood. Your way doesn't matter. Your preferences, your judgments, your desires, your anger, none of it matters. You exist to accommodate, to submit, to support. And if you feel angry about that, well, that's your sin to confess. But you know what's remarkable? Despite all of this, despite centuries of teaching women that their anger was sinful and their voices should be silent, some women still found ways to speak. Through letters, through embroidery, through carefully coded language, through religious devotion, through the tiny acts of daily resistance that never made it into the history books. They found ways to say, I'm here, I have thoughts, I disagree, I'm angry, without saying those words directly. And we know this because when we look at medieval sources carefully, when we read between the lines of household manuals and church sermons and legal documents, we find constant anxiety about women's speech. The authorities are always warning about women gossiping, women complaining, women speaking out of turn. If women were actually ardent, actually perfectly submissive, why would there be so many rules trying to make them that way? The existence of all those rules tells us that women were resisting, were speaking, were expressing anger, despite the consequences. There's a medieval text, a sermon, actually, that warns men about their wives' tongues. It says that a wife's tongue is more dangerous than a sword, that her words can destroy a man's reputation, that her complaints can undermine his authority. And on one level, this is just misogyny, just the fear of women's speech that runs through medieval culture. But on another level, it's an admission that women's words had power, that their anger, even when not directly expressed, was threatening, that men were actually afraid of what their wives might say. So the silencing wasn't complete. It couldn't be, because you can't actually stop people from thinking, from feeling, from finding ways to communicate what they're not supposed to say. You can make it harder, more dangerous, more costly. You can punish women who speak out. You can teach them from birth to distrust their own emotions, but you can't actually silence them completely, and that's something worth holding on to as we move through these stories of medieval marriage. Yes, the constraints were real. Yes, the silences were enforced. Yes, countless women lived and died without ever being able to fully express what they thought and felt. But humans are creative. Humans find ways, and medieval women found ways to speak that anger, that frustration, that conviction that things were not as they should be. We've covered so much ground now: the unspoken love, the forbidden financial discussions, the regulated intimacy, the impossible consent, and now the suppressed anger. But there's another conversation that medieval couples couldn't have, and it might surprise you because it seems so practical, so necessary. We haven't yet talked about children, not the making of children, but the aftermath, the living, growing, breathing children who resulted from medieval marriages. Because when those children were daughters instead of sons, when the desperate prayers for a male heir went unanswered, there were things husbands and wives couldn't say to each other. Cruel things, desperate things, blaming things. And those silences around children, around the sons that didn't come and the daughters who did, those silences carried their own particular kind of pain. That's the territory we need to explore next. Every medieval wife knew the unspoken rule. Your primary job was to produce a son, not a child, a son specifically. Daughters were fine, useful even. They could be married off to create alliances. But sons inherited. Sons carried the family name forward. Sons were proof that God favoured your marriage. And if you couldn't produce a son, if you bore only daughters, or worse, no children at all, then no matter what else you did right, you had failed at the most fundamental purpose of your existence. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. The Church explicitly taught that a husband could not divorce his wife for failing to give birth to a male heir. Daughters, the theologians said, were God's will. The sex of a child was determined by divine providence, not by any failure of the mother. This sounds progressive, almost protective of women, and yet it didn't protect them at all. Because while a husband couldn't divorce his wife for bearing daughters, he could certainly blame her. He could resent her. He could make her life miserable. He just couldn't say it out loud. So what couldn't medieval couples say to each other when the midwife announced it's a girl for the third, fourth, fifth time? They couldn't say, I'm disappointed. They couldn't say, this is your fault. They couldn't say, I'm terrified we'll never have a son. All of these feelings existed. We know they did from the historical record, but they couldn't be spoken directly, especially not between husband and wife. Let me tell you about one of the most famous examples, Catherine of Aragon and Henry VIII. Now I know what you're thinking. We've heard this story 100 times, but stay with me because what's often overlooked is the years of silence before Henry finally exploded into his quest for an annulment. Catherine and Henry married in 1509. Catherine was the Spanish princess, widow of Henry's older brother Arthur. The marriage was politically important, diplomatically necessary, and at first it seemed blessed. Catherine became pregnant quickly. But the baby, a daughter, was stillborn. Then another pregnancy, another daughter died after a few weeks. Then finally, in 1516, a healthy baby girl, Mary. 7 years of marriage, multiple pregnancies, and only one surviving child, a daughter. Now here's what we know from private letters and accounts. Henry was worried. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile. Henry's own father had won the crown through battle, not inheritance. England needed a male heir to prevent civil war when Henry died. Catherine knew this. Everyone knew this. But what could they say to each other? Could Henry say to Catherine, your inability to bear a son is endangering my kingdom? No, because that would be blaming her for something the Church said was God's will. Could Catherine say to Henry, I'm trying, I'm desperate, every pregnancy that fails breaks my heart? Perhaps in private, in whispered moments. But even then, the full weight of that desperation, that fear, that sense of failure, how do you voice that to the person whose disappointment you fear most? So they maintained a public facade. Henry called Catherine his true and loving wife. Catherine performed her queenly duties with grace. But underneath, for years, the unspoken question hung between them: will there ever be a son? Medieval medical understanding made this worse, not better. Remember, they believed that both parents contributed to the sex of the child, but they had elaborate theories about what determined whether that child would be male or female. Some texts suggested it depended on which side of the womb the child implanted in. The right side produced boys, the left side produced girls. Others said it depended on the heat of the parents' bodies during conception, or the strength of their seed, or the phase of the moon, or any number of factors that were essentially random but felt like they should be controllable. So when a couple had only daughters, both partners might wonder, what are we doing wrong? Is there something we should do differently? But they couldn't discuss this honestly, because any such discussion would require talking explicitly about sex, about their bodies, about intimate details that propriety forbade. A husband couldn't say to his wife, perhaps we should try to conceive when you're hotter, without violating every rule of appropriate marital discourse. A wife certainly couldn't say to her husband, maybe if you approached this differently, without suggesting that she was monitoring, analysing, critiquing his sexual performance, which would be unthinkably forward. So couples struggled in parallel silences, each one worrying, each one feeling responsible, neither able to share those fears honestly. But here's something that often gets overlooked. What about the daughters themselves? Imagine being born into a family desperately hoping for a son, and you're not one, you're a daughter. And every time your mother becomes pregnant again, everyone prays it will be a boy this time. The physicians come, the astrologers are consulted, prayers are said, and then you're born, another girl, and you can feel the disappointment even if no one says it aloud. Princess Mary, daughter of Henry and Catherine, grew up knowing she was meant to be a boy. She was raised as the heir, given an excellent education, taught statecraft and languages, because for years she was the only child. But she also knew she was a placeholder. Everyone was waiting for the son who would replace her. Can you imagine the psychological impact of that? Knowing you're wanted, but not quite wanted enough. Valuable, but not as valuable as a brother would be. And Mary couldn't say to her parents, "Do you wish I were a boy?" She knew the answer already. She couldn't say, "Am I enough?" Because the question itself would be disrespectful, would reveal doubts about her parents' love that a good daughter shouldn't have. So she had to carry that knowledge silently, that she was beloved but insufficient, cherished but inadequate. There's a heartbreaking pattern in medieval records. When a queen or noblewoman gave birth to a daughter, the celebrations were muted. Not absent. Daughters had value after all, but definitely muted. When a son was born, there would be elaborate festivities, tournaments, gifts to the poor, grand announcements. When a daughter was born, there might be a quiet christening, and then everyone would start hoping the next pregnancy would yield better results. Can you imagine being the mother in that scenario? You've just gone through the danger and pain of childbirth. You're exhausted, possibly injured, certainly vulnerable, and the first thing you feel from everyone around you is disappointment. Not at you exactly, remember the church said it's God's will, but disappointment nonetheless. And you can't acknowledge it. You can't say, "I know you wanted a son. I wanted a son too. I'm so sorry." Because saying that would be questioning God's judgment. So you have to pretend to be joyful about your daughter while feeling the weight of everyone's unspoken wishes that she was something else. And the husband? He's supposed to be grateful for any healthy child. He's supposed to trust God's plan. But inside he might be calculating, how many years of childbearing does my wife have left? How many more chances do we have? If every pregnancy produces a daughter, What happens to my legacy, my lands, my family name? But he can't voice these calculations to his wife because doing so would be cruel, would reveal that he's already given up hope, would hurt her when she's most vulnerable. So he says, God has blessed us with a healthy daughter, and he means it. He's not lying, but he's also not saying what else he's thinking, that we need a son. There's a story from the Chronicles about a nobleman in 13th century England. His name is lost, but the story survived, whose wife bore him 7 daughters in a row. 7. The nobleman was reportedly kind to his wife, never blamed her publicly, continued to treat her with respect. But after the 7th daughter was born, he quietly took a mistress. Not to replace his wife, she remained his legal spouse, the lady of his household, but to try for a son elsewhere. And here's the cruel part. This was considered reasonable. The nobleman couldn't divorce his wife for bearing only daughters, but he could seek a son through other means, and society largely accepted this. What could his wife not say when she discovered the mistress? She couldn't say, "You've broken our marriage vows." Well, she could, but adultery by men was much less serious than adultery by women. She couldn't say, "This is my fault, I'm sorry I failed you," because that would be admitting to a failure that the church said wasn't hers to own. She couldn't say, "I'm heartbroken," because heartbreak over something that was reasonable and necessary would seem selfish. So what could she say? Probably nothing. Probably she just had to accept it and continue managing the household and raising those 7 daughters while her husband tried to get a son elsewhere. Now let's flip this for a moment. What about couples who had sons but longed for daughters? This did happen. It's just rarely recorded because it went against the cultural narrative. But there are hints in private letters of mothers who grieved when they lost infant daughters, who felt affection for their girls that went beyond viewing them as marriage pawns. And yet they couldn't say, "I'm relieved it's a girl," or "I love my daughters more than my sons," or even, "I wish I'd had more daughters." To say such things would be incomprehensible, almost unnatural. There's a fascinating medical text from the 14th century that discusses how to influence the sex of a child. It recommends various techniques: sleeping on the right side, consuming certain foods, timing conception according to astrological charts. And what's interesting is that all these recommendations are aimed at producing sons. There's no equivalent text on how to have daughters. The assumption is that everyone wants sons, that no one would need instructions on having daughters because daughters happen accidentally, by default, when the techniques for producing sons fail. So a woman who secretly preferred daughters, who found them easier to relate to or more pleasant to raise, had no way to express that preference. And a man who enjoyed his daughter's company, who found them intelligent and capable, and some medieval fathers definitely did, he couldn't say, "I'm content with daughters," without appearing strange, without seeming to lack proper ambition for his lineage. There's a legend, possibly apocryphal but widely believed in the medieval period, that Thomas Aquinas' mother tried to produce a daughter because she wanted a child who would stay home with her, while sons were expected to go off to become knights or clergy. When she had a son instead, the future St. Thomas, she was supposedly disappointed. Now, this story might not be true, but the fact that people told it, that they found it believable, tells us that some women did prefer daughters, even though they could never say so publicly. And here's another layer. What about women who couldn't have children at all? In a world where bearing children was seen as a woman's primary purpose, infertility was devastating. But here's the question. Whose fault was it? Medieval medicine blamed women almost exclusively. If a couple couldn't conceive, it was assumed to be the wife's failing. Her womb was too cold or too hot or misaligned or cursed. The idea that the husband might be infertile existed but was rarely considered unless impotence was obvious. So an infertile wife carried a double burden. the grief of wanting children and not having them, plus the social stigma of being seen as defective. And she couldn't defend herself. She couldn't say to her husband, "Maybe it's you, not me." She couldn't say to the doctors, "Your treatments aren't working because you've misdiagnosed the problem." She certainly couldn't say to society, "My worth isn't determined by my fertility." All she could do was submit to increasingly invasive and probably useless medical treatments, pray constantly, and accept the judgment that she had somehow failed at being a woman. Meanwhile, her husband couldn't admit that maybe, possibly, he might be the problem. Male infertility was associated with impotence, and impotence was seen as emasculating, as a sign of weakness or even divine punishment. So even if a husband suspected he was the cause of their childlessness, he would rarely pursue that line of inquiry. It was safer, socially and psychologically, to assume his wife was the problem. This created marriages where both partners might know deep down that he was infertile, but they could never discuss it. They'd go through the motions of treatments aimed at her. They'd pray together for God to open her womb. They'd consult physicians who would prescribe herbs and procedures for her body. And neither could speak the truth, that they were treating the wrong person, that the silence around male infertility was causing her to suffer for his condition. Think about the conversations that couldn't happen. After years of trying, a wife couldn't say, "Have you considered that you might be the reason we have no children?" A husband couldn't admit, "I fear I'm failing in this fundamental duty." They couldn't grieve together honestly, couldn't share their fears, couldn't problem solve as a team. Because the problem had already been defined, she was barren, and questioning that definition was forbidden. Queen Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII's second wife, the one he married after breaking with Rome to divorce Catherine, Anne experienced this acutely. She gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs, but Henry wanted a son. Anne became pregnant multiple times after Elizabeth, but miscarried repeatedly, and the pressure on her was immense. Her position, her safety, her very life depended on producing a male heir. When she miscarried a son in 1536, Henry basically decided she'd failed him. Within months, she was accused of adultery and executed. Now, modern historians believe Anne's miscarriages might have been caused by stress, or by a blood-type incompatibility with Henry, or various other medical factors. But in 1536 the conclusion was simple. She couldn't give him a son, therefore she was disposable. And Anne couldn't say, "Maybe the problem is you, Henry. You've had multiple wives now, and only daughters survive." She couldn't say, "The stress you're putting on me is probably causing these miscarriages." She couldn't even say, "I'm terrified." And all she could do was try again, fail again, and ultimately pay with her life for something that wasn't entirely or even primarily her responsibility. The cruelty of this violence around children's sex is that it took something natural. Some couples have more daughters, some have more sons, some have both, some have neither, and turned it into a measure of divine favour or punishment, of female adequacy or failure, of male lineage success or extinction. And because it was framed as God's will, no one could critique the system. No one could say, "Perhaps we're placing too much importance on having sons." No one could suggest, "Maybe daughters are just as valuable." No one could argue, "Maybe fertility or infertility isn't a moral judgment." Those ideas were, quite literally, unspeakable. And so generation after generation of medieval couples carried the weight of this silence. The disappointment when daughters were born, the fear when no children came at all, the resentment that couldn't be voiced, the blame that couldn't be assigned, the grief that couldn't be shared. We've explored so many silences now. The inability to speak love, to discuss money, to negotiate intimacy, to express anger, to voice the truth about children. But there's another silence we haven't examined yet, one that's going to surprise you because it seems so fundamental to medieval life. We haven't talked about what happened when one spouse betrayed the other, when adultery entered the marriage. Because in a world where marriage was permanent and divorce nearly impossible, when infidelity occurred, there were things that couldn't be said even then, the accusations that couldn't be made, the forgiveness that couldn't be offered, the double standards that shaped everything. That's the territory we need to enter next, the unequal silence around betrayal. Here's a fact that tells you everything about medieval marriage. If a wife committed adultery, she could lose her nose and ears, literally cut off as punishment. In some regions of medieval Europe, a woman caught in adultery could be mutilated, branded, paraded naked through the streets, or even killed by her husband with minimal legal consequence. But if a husband committed adultery, he might be mildly censured, he might be told to do penance, he might be separated from his wife from bed and board, meaning they'd live apart but remain married. But he kept his nose, he kept his ears, he kept his life. So what couldn't medieval couples say when infidelity entered their marriage? Well, wives couldn't say, "This is unfair." They couldn't say, "You're holding me to a standard you don't follow yourself." They couldn't say, "Your betrayal hurts just as much as mine would." Because the entire legal, religious, and social structure was built on the premise that male and female adultery were fundamentally different crimes. Let me take you to the law codes of medieval England. The laws of Knut the Great, written in the early 11th century, are explicit about this double standard. If a married woman commits adultery and it becomes public, the law says, let her lose both her nose and her ears, and let her lawful husband have all that she possesses, all of it, her property, her dowry, everything, and oh yes, also her face. But for men, the law says, if a married man commits adultery with his own slave, let him lose her and make amends for himself to God and to men. And he who has a lawful wife and also a concubine, let no priest administer to him any of those rites which ought to be administered to a Christian man before he desist. Do you see the difference? A woman loses her property, her face, possibly her life. A man loses access to church sacraments until he agrees to give up his concubine. And even then, the law frames it as a religious failing, not a crime against his wife. The wife isn't even mentioned as the injured party. This wasn't just theoretical. This happened. There are court records of women being mutilated for adultery. There are accounts of husbands killing unfaithful wives and facing minimal punishment. Sometimes just a fine, sometimes nothing at all. Because a husband killing an adulterous wife was seen as defending his honor, protecting his bloodline, ensuring that illegitimate children didn't inherit his property. It was understood as reasonable, even righteous. But here's what makes the silence around this even more complex. What could a wife say when she discovered her husband's infidelity? She couldn't accuse him the way he could accuse her. Oh, technically, she could bring a complaint to the church courts. She could seek a separation, but doing so required publicly admitting that her husband preferred someone else, that she'd failed to keep him satisfied, that she was inadequate. The shame of his adultery somehow reflected back on her. And even if she did complain, even if she took him to court, the best she could hope for was separation from bed and board. This meant they'd live apart. He'd provide some financial support, she'd maintain her status as his wife, but neither could remarry, ever. She'd be stuck in this limbo, neither truly married nor free for the rest of her life or his. So many wives must have made a calculation. Is the public humiliation of accusing him worth the meagre remedy I might receive? Or is it better to pretend I don't know, to maintain the fiction of a proper marriage, to sullow my anger and hurt, rather than become the object of everyone's pity and gossip. There's a story from Chaucer. Yes, I'm going back to Chaucer because he understood medieval marriage better than almost anyone, about a merchant who discovers his wife has been unfaithful. In Chaucer's tale, the merchant forgives her after she cleverly talks her way out of the accusation. It's meant to be funny, a bit bawdy, but underneath the humour is a truth. Even when a wife's adultery was discovered, sometimes the husband would choose silence over scandal, because a public accusation meant everyone knew he'd been cuckolded, that he'd failed to control his wife, that his honour was damaged. Sometimes silence, pretending not to know, was less humiliating than the truth. But flip that around. When a husband was unfaithful, the wife had to maintain that same silence, but for different reasons. She had to pretend not to know, or pretend not to care, because to complain would be to challenge his authority, to suggest that his behaviour should be governed by her feelings. And that was simply not how medieval marriage worked. Let me tell you about a real case that made it into the historical record. In Provence, in the 13th century, there was a legal dispute involving a noblewoman who accused her husband of adultery. The husband's defence? He admitted to the affair but argued that his mistress was a woman of good character, a noble and virtuous lady, not some common prostitute, and therefore, he argued, his adultery was actually honourable. He was having an affair with a woman worthy of his attention. And here's the remarkable part. Some of his peers agreed with him. They said essentially, well, if you're going to commit adultery, at least you chose a high-quality mistress. The wife's complaint was dismissed, not because he hadn't been unfaithful, but because his infidelity was with an appropriate person, which somehow made it acceptable. Can you imagine being that wife? Your husband admits to betraying you, and the response isn't sympathy for you, but admiration for his taste in mistresses. And you can't say what you're really thinking. None of this should matter. He broke our vows. He chose someone else. The quality of his mistress is irrelevant. Because framing adultery as a question of the mistress's social status, rather than a violation of marriage vows, that was just how people thought. There's an even more extreme version of this in some medieval romance literature. Knights would openly dedicate their deeds to ladies who were not their wives. They'd wear another woman's colours in tournaments, they'd write poetry to her, they'd pledge their loyalty to her, and all of this was considered noble and good as long as the love remained unconsummated, and as long as it stayed in the realm of courtly devotion rather than physical adultery. But here's the thing. Everyone knew this was a fiction. Everyone understood that courtly love was often a polite way of describing an affair. The poetry, the dedications, the wearing of colours, these were public declarations of romantic attachment to someone other than your spouse. And wives had to watch this happen, had to see their husbands publicly honour other women, and they couldn't say this is a betrayal. Because technically, if the affair wasn't consummated, or if everyone agreed to pretend it wasn't consummated, it didn't count as adultery. So medieval wives learned to distinguish between affairs that mattered and affairs that didn't. An affair with a social equal kept relatively discreet, not resulting in illegitimate children who might threaten the inheritance. That was something you ignored. You didn't like it, but you ignored it. An affair with a servant or with multiple women, or that produced bastard children, or that became so public it humiliated you, those you might complain about. But even then, your complaint had to be framed carefully. Not, you hurt me, but you're damaging the family's honour. Not, I feel betrayed, but this is improper conduct for someone of your station. Meanwhile, if a wife even looked at another man with too much interest, she could be accused of adultery in her heart, if not in fact. There are records of wives being punished for suspected adultery based on nothing more than gossip, or a man's accusation, or their own husband's paranoia. The standard of proof required to punish a wife was shockingly low. The standard required to punish a husband was almost impossibly high. And here's where the silence becomes most toxic. Either partner could honestly discuss the reasons behind infidelity. A husband couldn't say to his wife, "I'm having an affair because our marriage feels empty," because that would be admitting to emotional needs that men weren't supposed to have. A wife certainly couldn't say, "I understand why you might seek connection elsewhere and I feel the same loneliness," because that would be admitting to her own potential for unfaithfulness, which was unthinkable. So couples who were both unhappy, both lonely, both seeking something their marriage didn't provide, couldn't help each other understand or heal. They just existed in parallel disappointments, sometimes acting on those disappointments in ways that hurt each other, but never actually talking about the underlying problems. There's a legal concept in the medieval canon law called separation from bed and board that I mentioned earlier, and we need to understand how it worked because it reveals so much about what couples couldn't say. If a marriage became intolerable through adultery or cruelty or one spouse joining a religious order, the church could grant this separation, but it wasn't a divorce. You were still married in the eyes of God and the law, you just didn't have to live together. And crucially, you couldn't remarry, ever. So what couldn't a separated couple say? They couldn't say, "I want to move on with my life." They couldn't say, "I'd like to find love again." They couldn't say, "This feels like punishment." We're separated, but still bound to each other. Because the church's position was clear, marriage is indissoluble. You said your vows before God. Those vows last until death, regardless of whether you're living together or whether the marriage has become a source of misery rather than companionship. This created a particularly cruel situation for wives who'd been betrayed. Your husband has an affair, you complain. The church investigates. They agree that yes, he's been unfaithful, so they separate you. Now you're living alone, neither married nor single, unable to remarry, dependent on whatever financial support your husband deigns to provide. He, meanwhile, continues living his life. He can't remarry either, technically, but he can have mistresses, can have illegitimate children, can move about society freely. Your punishment for his crime is isolation and limbo, and you can't say this isn't justice. You can't say you've freed him and imprisoned me, because the church would respond that they're protecting the sanctity of marriage, that they're upholding God's law, that earthly suffering is temporary but soul salvation is eternal. Your feelings about the practical reality of your situation were irrelevant to the theological principle at stake. There's a case from 14th century Italy that illustrates this perfectly. A merchant's wife discovered he had been keeping a mistress for years. The mistress had borne him 3 children. The wife complained to the church authorities. They investigated, confirmed the adultery, and separated the couple. But here's the twist. The merchant had to provide financial support for both his wife and his mistress. The same household funds now supported 2 separate establishments. The wife got her share, but she had to live with the knowledge that her husband's infidelity was literally being subsidized by the money that should have been entirely hers. She couldn't say, "Why am I being forced to financially support my husband's mistress?" She couldn't say, "This is adding insult to injury." Because the church's logic was that the children, even illegitimate ones, deserved support, and therefore the mother of those children needed support to care for them. The wife's feelings, her sense of betrayal, her outrage at the situation, none of that mattered to the legal framework deciding how to handle the case. Now, let's talk about something that might surprise you. There are records of wives having affairs too, not many. Women face such severe punishment that the risk was enormous, but it happened. And when it did, when a wife's adultery was discovered or suspected, there's something fascinating about how it was discussed. Men who'd been cuckolded couldn't just say, "My wife betrayed me." They had to frame it in terms of honor, property, bloodline. "She's endangered the legitimacy of my heirs. She's damaged my family's reputation. She's stolen from me by giving away what belonged exclusively to me." Notice what's absent. Genuine emotional pain. The language of medieval male cuckoldry is all about external damage, to reputation, to inheritance, to social standing. Men weren't supposed to admit that their wives' infidelity hurt them emotionally, that they felt rejected, or inadequate or heartbroken. That would be unmanly. So even men who were genuinely devastated by their wives' betrayal had to hide that pain behind anger about honor and property. And this meant that even in the rare cases where both spouses had been unfaithful, where both had betrayed each other, they couldn't have an honest conversation about what had gone wrong. He couldn't say, "Your affair hurt me deeply." She couldn't say, "I felt so alone in our marriage that I sought connection elsewhere." They couldn't jointly acknowledge, "We've both failed each other, and we need to either fix this or end it honestly." And all they could do was deploy the official language of honor and sin and property rights, which addressed none of the actual emotional reality of what they were experiencing. There's a particular cruelty in this, isn't there? That even when marriage broke down so catastrophically that both partners sought intimacy outside it, they still couldn't be honest with each other about why. The structure of medieval marriage was so rigid, the acceptable vocabulary so limited, that even infidelity, this supposedly unforgivable sin, couldn't be discussed in human terms. Geoffrey Chaucer's Wife of Bath is famous partly because she's so open about her multiple marriages and her attitudes towards sex and men. And one of the things she says, in that boisterous, defiant voice Chaucer gives her, is that men want sovereignty over women, but women want sovereignty too. She's talking about power, about who controls whom in marriage, and buried in her long rambling tale is an acknowledgement that the constant struggle over control, the inability to meet as equals, drives couples apart. Sometimes into infidelity, sometimes just into parallel lives of quiet resentment. But the Wife of Bath is a fictional character, and she's portrayed as scandalous, excessive, not quite respectable. A real medieval woman couldn't say what the Wife of Bath says. She couldn't joke about her multiple husbands. She couldn't admit that she wanted power in her marriage. And she certainly couldn't suggest that maybe, just maybe, if marriages were more equal, if partners could be honest with each other, there would be less infidelity and betrayal. We've walked through 8 layers of silence now: love unspoken, money undiscussed, bodies regulated, consent assumed, anger suppressed, children judged, and now betrayal tolerated when it flowed one direction and viciously punished when it flowed the other. But there are still more silences to uncover, and some of them are even more fundamental to daily life. We haven't yet talked about what medieval couples couldn't discuss regarding their own bodies, their health, the medical knowledge that might have helped them but was kept hidden. That's the territory we're entering next, the secret languages of medieval medicine and the whispered knowledge that women pass between themselves because their husbands could never hear it. Picture a medieval woman standing in her chamber, experiencing something she's never been taught to name, a pain in her abdomen, an irregularity in her cycle, a symptom that worries her, and in another room, perhaps the very next room, sits her husband, the person she's legally bound to, the person she shares a bed with, the person whose children she's borne, and she cannot tell him what she's experiencing. Not because he's cruel or uncaring, but because the very words to describe her body, her female body, don't exist in the vocabulary of respectable conversation between husband and wife. Medieval medicine had extensive knowledge about women's bodies. Physicians wrote detailed treatises about menstruation, conception, childbirth, female anatomy. But here's the cruel paradox. All of this knowledge was written in Latin, discussed among male scholars, and considered too indelicate for women themselves to read, or for husbands and wives to discuss. The body that women lived in was simultaneously the most studied and the most secret thing in medieval life. There's a text I mentioned before called De Secretis Mulierum, on the secrets of women. The title itself tells you everything. Women's bodies were secrets, not secrets women kept, mind you, but secrets kept from women about themselves. The text was attributed to Albertus Magnus, a 13th century theologian and scholar, though it was probably written by one of his students, and it's fascinating because it treats female anatomy and reproduction as mysteries that need to be unveiled, understood, controlled by male intellect. The text describes menstruation, explaining that women's bodies produce excess blood that must be expelled monthly. It discusses conception, suggesting that both male and female seed are necessary for pregnancy. It details the signs of virginity, the changes of pregnancy, the dangers of childbirth. All of this is useful information. All of this could have helped women understand their own bodies, could have helped couples navigate reproduction more successfully. But the text was written for men. It circulated among physicians, priests, educated nobles. Women themselves, the people actually experiencing these bodily processes, were largely excluded from this knowledge. So what couldn't a medieval wife say to her husband? She couldn't say, "My menstrual flow has changed and I'm worried." Because discussing menstruation with a man, even her husband, was deeply improper. She couldn't say, "I'm experiencing pain during intercourse and I think something is wrong," because that would require discussing the physical mechanics of sex, which women weren't supposed to analyze or critique. She couldn't say, "I think I might be pregnant, but I'm not certain and I'm frightened." Well, she could say the pregnancy part. That was acceptable. But the fear? The admission that she didn't understand what was happening in her own body? That revealed a vulnerability that might be seen as weakness. Let me tell you about Trotula of Salerno. She's one of the most remarkable figures in medieval medicine, though much of her story is disputed. Trotula was apparently a female physician in 11th century Italy, and texts attributed to her discuss women's health in unusually practical, compassionate ways. The Trotula texts, whether written by a woman or simply attributed to one, give advice on childbirth, gynecological problems, even contraception, and how to make sex less painful. But here's what's interesting. Even these texts, which seem designed to help women, contain instructions for deception. One passage describes how a woman can use certain herbs to make it appear she's a virgin on her wedding night, if her hymen has already been broken. Another explains how to conceal a pregnancy or fake one if needed. The Trotula texts acknowledge that women lived in a world where they sometimes needed to hide the truth about their bodies even from their husbands, and these texts provided the tools to do so. Think about what that means. Medical knowledge was being passed down specifically to help women deceive their husbands about their own physical state. Not because women were naturally dishonest, but because honesty about certain bodily realities could be dangerous. A woman who admitted her hymen had been broken before marriage, even if it happened through riding horses or some innocent accident, could be accused of not being a virgin, which could invalidate the marriage or bring shame on her family. A woman who couldn't conceal a miscarriage might face questions about whether she'd deliberately caused it. Women needed medical knowledge not just to understand their bodies, but to manage what information about those bodies became public. And husbands, what couldn't they know? Well, they couldn't know the details of what their wives experienced during menstruation. even though it affected their intimate life together. They couldn't know the real physical toll of pregnancy and childbirth, even though they expected their wives to go through it repeatedly. They couldn't know about the folk remedies and herbal knowledge that women passed among themselves, even though those remedies sometimes saved lives. There was this entire parallel medical system that existed among women. Midwives, wise women, female neighbours. They shared knowledge that never made it into the official Latin texts. They knew which herbs could ease menstrual pain, which could bring on a late period, which could reduce the risk of dying in childbirth. They knew techniques for turning a breech baby, for helping a difficult labour, for dealing with the 1,000 complications that could arise. And they passed this knowledge woman to woman, mother to daughter, midwife to patient, in whispered conversations that men were excluded from. This wasn't because women wanted to keep secrets from men. It was because the official medical establishment, male, Latin-speaking, university-educated, didn't actually deal with most of women's health issues. Male physicians rarely attended births. They rarely examined women's bodies directly. When they did write about women's health, it was often theoretical, based on ancient Greek and Roman texts, rather than on actually talking to women about their experiences. So women developed their own medical knowledge out of necessity. And because it existed outside official channels, because it was oral rather than written, because it was vernacular rather than Latin, it was considered suspect, dangerous even. The line between a wise woman who knew herbal remedies and a witch who practiced malevolent magic was disturbingly thin. Women who knew too much about bodies, who could control fertility or ease pain or predict complications, these women were valuable but also threatening. And this meant that a wife couldn't even tell her husband that she'd consulted a wise woman without potentially raising suspicions. If she successfully treated her own illness using herbal knowledge passed down from other women, she might be asked how she knew what to do. And if she explained, "Old Marjorie in the village told me," she'd be admitting to participating in this unofficial, unregulated system of knowledge that the church and the medical establishment viewed with suspicion. There's a documented case from 14th century England where a woman was accused of witchcraft, partly because she knew how to prevent pregnancy. Her neighbours testified that she'd helped several women avoid conception using herbal methods. Now, this same knowledge existed in medical texts. Remember, the Trotula text discussed contraception. But when an educated male physician wrote about it in Latin, it was medicine. When a village woman practiced it and taught it to other women, it was potentially witchcraft. The woman in this case was eventually cleared, but think about what this means for marital communication. A wife who used contraceptive methods, perhaps because another pregnancy might kill her, perhaps because she had already borne 6 children and her body couldn't take more. She couldn't tell her husband what she was doing. He might report her. He might accuse her of witchcraft. At the very least, he'd be obligated to stop her, because contraception was sinful according to church teaching. So women who practiced any form of birth control had to do so secretly, had to pretend each pregnancy was God's will, had to hide their own agency over their reproductive lives. But let's talk about something even more fundamental: pain. Medieval people experienced a lot of pain. Toothaches, injuries, chronic conditions that today would be easily treated, and the ability to express pain, to ask for help with it, to explain its nature and location, this varied dramatically depending on your gender. Men could complain about pain relatively freely. A knight with a war wound could describe exactly where it hurt and how much. A merchant with gout could discuss his symptoms with physicians. Male pain was taken seriously, was seen as a legitimate medical concern. But female pain, especially pain related to reproduction, was considered natural, expected, something women should endure silently. Menstrual pain? That was just part of being a woman. Pain during sex? Well, that probably meant you weren't aroused enough, which meant you weren't fulfilling your wifely duty properly. Pain during pregnancy? Expected. Pain during childbirth? God's punishment on women for Eve's sin. Women were supposed to suffer these pains as part of their nature, their punishment, their lot in life. Complaining about them was seen as weakness, as failure to accept God's will. So a wife experiencing severe menstrual cramping couldn't say to her husband, "I need rest, this pain is debilitating." She couldn't say, "I think something is wrong, this pain is different from usual." She had to continue her duties, manage the household, fulfill her obligations, all while experiencing pain that she couldn't name or ask for help with. And here's something that might surprise you. Medieval physicians actually recognized that women experienced pain during menstruation and childbirth. They wrote about it in their texts, they theorized about its causes, but the dominant theological interpretation was that this pain was divinely ordained, a consequence of original sin, and therefore shouldn't be alleviated. To try to reduce women's pain in childbirth was, in some interpretations, to go against God's judgment on Eve. In pain you shall bring forth children. This created an impossible situation. Women were in pain. Physicians knew they were in pain. Remedies existed that could help, but using those remedies might be seen as defying God's will. So women suffered, and their husbands watched them suffer, and neither could speak honestly about whether this was necessary or just. There's a beautiful, heartbreaking prayer that survives from medieval England. It's a prayer for women in childbirth, and it asks God for mercy, for a safe delivery, for the survival of both mother and child. And tucked into this prayer is a line that essentially says, "Please let this not hurt as much as it usually does." Even in prayer, even in direct communication with God, women could barely voice the request for less pain. They had to frame it apologetically, hopefully, as a favour rather than a right. Now, pregnancy itself was another area of enforced silence. Women were expected to bear children, but they weren't supposed to complain about how difficult pregnancy was. They couldn't say to their husbands, "I feel nauseated every morning and can barely eat." They couldn't say, "My back aches constantly from carrying this weight." They couldn't say, "I'm terrified because my sister died in childbirth and I might too." All of these realities of pregnancy had to be borne silently, or at least discussed only with other women who'd been through it. And husbands, for their part, weren't educated about pregnancy. They had no idea what their wives were experiencing. The medical texts that discuss pregnancy were in Latin and focused on theory rather than practical symptoms. So a husband might see his wife growing larger, might notice she was more tired or more emotional, but he had no framework for understanding why or how to help. And she couldn't explain it to him without violating the taboo against discussing bodily functions. This created marriages where the woman might be pregnant for a significant portion of their years together, experiencing profound physical changes, but the man remained essentially ignorant of what was happening inside his own household. He knew the result. A baby would arrive in 9 months, but the process was a mystery to him. There's a medieval illustration that I find particularly telling. It shows a woman in labour surrounded by other women, midwives, female relatives, neighbours, and in the background, visible through a doorway, you can see men waiting outside. That was the standard arrangement. When a woman went into labour, the men left. Even her husband, especially her husband. Childbirth was women's business. Men weren't supposed to witness it, weren't supposed to see the blood and pain and danger of it. Which meant that husbands literally didn't know what their wives went through to bear their children. They'd see them pregnant, then they'd be sent away during the birth, then they'd be presented with a baby and told whether their wife had survived or not. The entire most dangerous, most painful, most significant event in their wife's life happened behind closed doors, and they weren't allowed to be part of it. And women couldn't describe it afterward. To tell your husband the details of your labour, how long it took, how much it hurt, how close you came to dying, that would be indelicate. That would be forcing him to imagine your body in ways that weren't appropriate. So even after surviving childbirth, even after going through something that might have been traumatic or terrifying, women had to keep it to themselves. They could share with other women who'd been through it, but their husbands, the fathers of the children they'd risked their lives to bear, those men remained ignorant. The cumulative effect of all these silences around the body is staggering. Couples who shared beds couldn't share basic information about how those bodies worked. Partners who created children together couldn't discuss the process of creation or birth. Husbands and wives who lived together for decades remained essentially ignorant of each other's physical experiences because the vocabulary for discussing bodies simply didn't exist between men and women, even married ones. And this ignorance had consequences. Women died from conditions that might have been treatable if they'd felt able to describe their symptoms earlier. Couples remained childless because neither partner understood fertility well enough to optimize their chances. Marriages were unhappy because physical incompatibility or pain couldn't be discussed or addressed. The silence around bodies didn't just prevent conversation, it caused actual harm. We've explored 9 layers of silence now, and we're nearing the end of this journey through medieval marriage. We've seen how couples couldn't speak of love, money, intimacy, children, betrayal, or even their own bodies. But there are still 3 silences left to examine, and they're all connected to the ultimate questions. What happens to your property when you die? What happens to your children? What happens to your spouse? We haven't yet talked about inheritance, about the future that couples couldn't plan together, about the conversations that never happened regarding what came after death. That's where we're heading next, into the silence around endings. Death was always close in the Middle Ages. Disease, childbirth, war accidents. People died young, died suddenly, died without warning. And yet despite death being such a constant presence, medieval couples rarely discussed what would happen after one of them was gone. They lived together, built lives together, raised children together, but they couldn't sit down and honestly plan for the future that would come when one of them wasn't there anymore. Why? Because discussing what happened after your spouse's death meant discussing inheritance, and discussing inheritance meant confronting uncomfortable truths about power, about ownership, about whose life mattered more in the eyes of the law. A wife couldn't ask her husband, "What will happen to me when you die?" without revealing that she was thinking about his death, which might seem mercenary or even threatening. A husband couldn't tell his wife, "I've decided to leave most of my estate to our eldest son," without admitting that her future security was entirely dependent on their children's goodwill. So couples lived in this strange state of enforced optimism, pretending they'd both live forever, never planning together for the inevitable. Let me explain how inheritance worked in medieval England, because it's more complicated than you might think. When a man died, his widow was entitled to her dower, 1/3 of everything he'd owned. We talked about this earlier, in the context of wealthy widows. But what I didn't explain is that the widow only got to use that property during her lifetime. She couldn't sell it. She couldn't leave it to anyone in her will. When she died, it reverted back to her husband's estate, to be inherited by his heirs. So a wife's security after her husband's death was real but temporary. She had income, she had property, but she didn't truly own it. It was hers to use but not to control, and she couldn't discuss this with her husband while he was alive, because to do so would be to ask about the future distribution of his property, which was entirely his decision to make, not hers to question. But here's where it gets really interesting. What if a husband wanted to leave his wife less than the standard 1/3? What if he wanted to leave everything to their children or to the church, or even to a mistress? He couldn't really do that, the dower was protected by law, but he could make her life after his death miserable in other ways. He could arrange the estate so that the most valuable properties went to others, leaving her with the required 1/3 but making sure it was the least profitable third. He could set up trusts and arrangements that technically complied with dower law, but practically left her with very little. And she couldn't say, "I'm worried you're planning to cut me out." She couldn't say, "Promise me you'll ensure I'm taken care of." Because to voice those concerns would be to admit she didn't trust him, which would be failing in her wifely duty of faith and obedience. So women lived with this uncertainty, knowing that their entire future depended on decisions their husbands were making in private with lawyers and advisors in conversations the wives weren't part of. There's a case from 15th century York that illustrates this perfectly. A merchant died, and his widow discovered that he'd made arrangements transferring most of his valuable property to a religious foundation before his death. Technically, she still got her 1/3 dower, but the 1/3 was calculated based on what he owned at death, which was much less than what he'd owned a few years earlier. He'd essentially impoverished his estate to benefit the church, knowing his wife would be left with 1/3 of very little. The widow challenged this in court, arguing that the transfers had been made specifically to deprive her of her rightful dower, and the court had to decide, did a husband have the right to dispose of his property as he wished during his lifetime, even if it meant his widow would be left nearly destitute? Or did the wife's dower right extend backward in time, protecting her from this kind of strategic impoverishment? The court ruled against the widow. They said that a man's right to control his property while alive was absolute. If he wanted to give it all to the church, that was his prerogative. The wife's dower only attached to whatever remained at death. This widow, who'd been married to this man for over 20 years, who'd borne his children and managed his household, had no legal recourse. Her husband had legally screwed her over, and she'd never even known it was happening until after he died. Now, imagine being married and knowing this could happen, knowing that your husband could, at any moment, be making arrangements that would leave you impoverished after his death, and you had no right to know about it, no ability to stop it, no legal standing to even ask about it. How do you live with that uncertainty? How do you trust your spouse when the system is set up to allow him to betray you in the most fundamental way? But let's flip this around. What about husbands? What couldn't they discuss with their wives? Well, husbands couldn't admit that they were worried about dying and leaving their families vulnerable. Medieval masculinity required men to be strong, confident, and control. To say to your wife, "I'm afraid that if I die, our children won't be taken care of," would be admitting to fear, to uncertainty, to the limits of your power. Men were supposed to have everything arranged, everything under control, to be able to protect their families even from beyond the grave. So men made their wills in private, consulted with advisors, made arrangements, and never told their wives what they'd decided. And wives were expected to trust that their husbands had made wise choices, that they'd be taken care of, that everything would be fine. But they didn't know. They couldn't know, because asking would reveal doubt, and doubt would undermine the entire structure of wifely submission and husbandly authority. There's something particularly cruel about this when you consider second marriages. And second marriages were extremely common. Remember, people died young. A widow would remarry and she'd bring her dower from her first husband into the new marriage. But that dower was still only hers for her lifetime. When she died, it went back to her first husband's heirs, not to her second husband, or to the children of her second marriage. This created incredibly complicated family dynamics. A woman might have children from her first marriage and children from her second marriage, The children from her first marriage would inherit her dower from their father. But the children from her second marriage, they'd inherit whatever their father left them, but nothing from their mother's first marriage. So siblings with the same mother but different fathers would have wildly different inheritances. And the woman at the centre of all this couldn't really discuss it with either set of children or with her second husband. To talk openly about which children would get what would be to invite conflict, jealousy, resentment. So mothers had to watch their children from different marriages treated unequally by law and custom, and they couldn't acknowledge the unfairness of it, couldn't promise to make it right, couldn't even explain why things were set up this way. Let me tell you about a woman named Joan Beaufort. She lived in the 15th century and was married twice. Her first husband was Robert Ferrers, with whom she had several daughters. Her second husband was Ralph Neville, with whom she had many more children, including several who became quite powerful. Joan was wealthy, well-connected, politically astute. But here's the thing, the inheritance arrangements for her children were completely different depending on which husband was their father. Her daughters from her first marriage had rights to the Ferrers estate. Her children from her second marriage had rights to the Neville estate. Joan herself lived caught between these two family interests, and we have no record of her ever discussing this situation openly, of her explaining to her children why their inheritances were so different, of her acknowledging the unfairness of a system that divided her own children into separate camps based on who their father was. She probably couldn't have that conversation, because to do so would be to criticize the inheritance laws, which were seen as natural and divinely ordained. To complain about the system would be to question God's order. So Joan, like countless other women in similar situations, probably just managed as best she could, trying to maintain peace among children who had very different financial stakes in her life and death. Now let's talk about something even darker. What happened when a husband decided his wife was inconvenient? We've mentioned before that divorce didn't exist in medieval Catholicism, but there was an option that some powerful men used, forcing their wives into convents. If a husband could convince or coerce his wife to take religious vows, she'd become a nun, and the marriage would be dissolved. Not annulled, not divorced, but ended because one party had essentially married God. And here's the insidious part. Once she was in the convent, the husband could remarry. He'd be free, she'd be locked away. And any property she'd brought to the marriage, any inheritance she had rights to, would now be controlled by her former husband or revert to her family. She'd have no property rights as a nun, no ability to manage her own affairs, no freedom to leave. This didn't happen constantly. It required a certain level of power and ruthlessness, but it happened enough that it was a known strategy. A husband who wanted to be rid of his wife, who perhaps wanted to marry someone else or who found his wife politically inconvenient, could pressure her to voluntarily enter a convent. And the wife, what could she say? I don't want to dedicate my life to God. That would sound sinful. I think you're trying to get rid of me so you can remarry. That would sound paranoid, accusatory. I'm afraid of what will happen to me if I agree to this. That would sound selfish, worldly, insufficiently spiritual. So some women ended up in convents not because they had a religious calling, but because their husbands had decided their marriages were over and this was the only legal way to end them. And those women couldn't say, this is unjust. They couldn't say, I'm being imprisoned for your convenience. They had to go quietly, piously, as though this were their own holy choice. There's a case. I'm going to be vague about the details, because the sources are fragmentary, of a noblewoman in 13th century France who was pressured into a convent by her husband. Years later, after he died, she petitioned the Pope to be released from her vows, claiming they'd been made under duress. The Pope investigated, and what the investigation revealed was heartbreaking. The woman had agreed to become a nun because her husband had threatened that if she didn't, he'd accuse her of adultery. A false accusation, but one that would have destroyed her reputation and possibly gotten her killed. So she'd chosen the convent, safety, even if it meant imprisonment, over the risk of her husband's false accusations, and she'd had to maintain the fiction that this was her pious choice, that she was answering God's call, when really she was escaping her husband's threats. The Pope eventually released her from her vows, acknowledging the coercion. But think about the years she spent silent, unable to tell anyone the truth, unable to say, "I'm here because my husband threatened me, not because I love God." Now, most marriages didn't end this dramatically. Most couples lived together until one of them died naturally. But even in those ordinary marriages, there was this unspoken understanding that the husband controlled the future. He decided what would happen to the property, to the children, to the wife herself after he was gone. And she had to trust that he'd make good decisions, because she had no power to ensure it. And what about children? We talked earlier about the pressure to produce sons and the disappointment around daughters, but we haven't talked about what happened to those children when parents died. Because inheritance laws didn't just affect widows, they profoundly shaped children's lives. In most of medieval Europe, the eldest son inherited everything. Not half, not a share, everything. The land, the title, the house, all of it went to the firstborn son. This was called primogeniture, and it was designed to keep estates intact, to prevent land from being divided into smaller and smaller pieces with each generation. But what about the younger sons? What about the daughters? They got whatever their father chose to give them, which might be a lot or might be nothing. Younger sons might be given money for an education, or training in a trade, or funding to enter the church. Daughters might be given dowries to make them marriageable. But none of this was guaranteed. It was entirely at the father's discretion, and parents couldn't really discuss this honestly with their children. The eldest son knew he'd inherit, but he couldn't know exactly what he'd be inheriting until it happened. Younger children knew they'd get less, but they couldn't ask, how much less? They couldn't say, is this fair? They couldn't challenge their father's decisions without appearing greedy, ungrateful, impious. So families lived with this knowledge hanging over them. Siblings knew they'd be treated unequally, but they couldn't acknowledge it. Younger sons might resent their older brothers, but they couldn't say so. Daughters might feel undervalued, but they had to pretend they understood it was God's plan. And parents, especially fathers, who made these decisions, couldn't admit that they were creating inequality among children they loved, that they were setting up their younger children for lesser lives simply because of birth order. There's a poignant letter from the 15th century, part of the famous Paston letters, where a younger son is pleading with his father for some provision, some guarantee of inheritance. He's not asking for equal treatment with his older brother. He's just asking for enough to live on, to make his own way in the world. And his father's response is essentially, "I'll decide what you get, and you'll be grateful for it." No negotiation, no discussion, just paternal authority asserting itself. The younger son couldn't say, "This isn't fair." He couldn't say, "I deserve security too." He couldn't even say, "I'm afraid of what will happen to me." All he could do was plead and hope, knowing that his entire future depended on his father's whim. We're getting close to the end of our journey now. We've explored 10 different silences that defined medieval marriage: love, money, sex, consent, anger, children, adultery, bodies, and now death and inheritance. But there are 2 silences left, and they're connected. We haven't yet talked about violence, about what happened when marriages turned cruel, when homes became dangerous, when the silence wasn't just frustrating but deadly. That's the hardest territory we need to walk through, but we can't understand medieval marriage without acknowledging it. And after that, we have one final silence to examine, the silence around grief, around loss, around saying goodbye when someone you've shared your life with is dying or dead. Those are the last pieces of this puzzle, and they complete the picture of what medieval husbands and wives could never say to each other. There's a phrase that appears over and over in medieval church law. A husband should not mistreat his wife without cause. Read that again, without cause. The church, the legal system, the moral authorities of medieval Europe, they all acknowledged that there might be legitimate reasons for a husband to mistreat his wife. The question wasn't whether he could hurt her, but whether he had good enough reason to do so. So what couldn't a medieval wife say when her husband crossed the line from discipline to abuse? She couldn't say, "You have no right to hurt me," because actually he did. She couldn't say, "This is wrong," because the response would be, "Did you give him cause?" She couldn't even say, "I'm afraid," because fear was seen as a natural part of the hierarchical relationship between husband and wife. A wife was supposed to fear her husband's authority. It kept her obedient, kept her in her place, kept the household ordered. Let me be clear about what medieval law actually permitted. A husband had the legal right to physically discipline his wife for what were considered legitimate infractions. If she disobeyed him, if she was unfaithful, if she was wasteful with household resources, if she spoke disrespectfully, all of these could justify physical correction. The only limitation was that he shouldn't be excessive, he shouldn't permanently injure her, he shouldn't kill her. But short of that, the law gave him considerable latitude. There's a concept that persisted through medieval times called the rule of thumb. Now this phrase has become controversial among historians. Some argue it's a myth, but the principle behind it was real. The idea was that a husband could beat his wife with a stick, as long as the stick was no thicker than his thumb. Reasonable correction, they called it. Moderate discipline, as if there's a thickness of stick that makes violence acceptable. Whether or not that specific rule was formally codified, the underlying assumption was universal. Husbands had the right to physically control their wives, and the legal system would only intervene in cases of extreme excess. And what counted as excess? That was disturbingly subjective. There's a case from a church court in 14th century England that shows how this played out. A woman came before the court claiming her husband had beaten her severely. She had witnesses, neighbours who'd heard her screaming, who'd seen the bruises. The court investigated. They questioned the husband, who admitted to hitting her, but said she'd provoked him by refusing to obey an order. He said he'd only hit her a few times, that he hadn't used excessive force, that he was exercising his rightful authority as head of household. The court's decision? They warned the husband to be more moderate in his corrections and sent the wife back home with him. That was it. No punishment for the husband, no protection for the wife, just a warning to be a bit gentler next time and an implicit message to the wife that she should try harder not to provoke him. The wife couldn't say what she must have been thinking. A few times? He beat me until I couldn't stand. Moderate? I thought he was going to kill me. Because the court had already decided that his violence was within acceptable bounds, that her suffering didn't matter as much as maintaining his authority, that her safety was less important than preserving the hierarchy of marriage. Now, here's where this gets even darker. A wife who left her husband because of violence, who fled to her parents' house or sought sanctuary in a church, she could be forced to return. The legal system didn't recognize "I'm afraid for my life" as a valid reason to leave a marriage. Remember the case I mentioned earlier, the woman who fled and whose defense was "he beats me and I fear for my life"? The court sent her back, with a warning to the husband to treat her reasonably, yes, but they sent her back, because marriage was indissoluble, because a wife's place was with her husband, because maintaining the institution of marriage was more important than protecting individual women from harm. The system literally valued the concept of marriage more than it valued women's lives. So what couldn't wives say in abusive marriages? They couldn't say, "Help me." Well, they could say it, but the help they'd receive would be inadequate at best, non-existent at worst. They couldn't say, "I want out," because there was no out. They couldn't say to their husbands, "If you hurt me again, I'll leave," because that would be an empty threat. Where would they go? How would they survive? They couldn't even say to their children, "Your father is hurting me," because that would be turning the children against their father, undermining his authority, teaching them that a wife could criticize her husband. There were women who did leave despite everything. Some fled to convents and begged to be taken in. Some returned to their families if their families would have them. Some simply disappeared into cities where they could become anonymous. But all of these options meant giving up everything: their property, their children, their social status, their security. And they risked being forcibly returned if their husbands pursued them. The church theoretically offered one form of protection: sanctuary. A woman fleeing violence could claim sanctuary in a church, and by law she couldn't be forcibly removed for 40 days. This gave her time to think, to rest, to possibly negotiate some arrangement. But 40 days is not very long when you're trying to figure out how to escape a violent marriage. And at the end of those 40 days, she'd have to either return to her husband or face the consequences of leaving: loss of everything, potential poverty, social ostracism. There's a heartbreaking pattern in medieval records of women claiming sanctuary repeatedly. The same woman would appear in church records claiming sanctuary, then disappear, then appear again months or years later claiming sanctuary again. These were women trapped in cycles of violence, fleeing, being returned, being hurt again, fleeing again, and the system just kept sending them back because preserving the marriage was always the priority. But let's talk about something even more insidious: psychological cruelty. Because not all marital abuse was physical. Some husbands were masters of verbal cruelty, of emotional manipulation, of creating households where their wives lived in constant anxiety, even if they were never physically struck. A husband could belittle his wife constantly, tell her she was stupid, useless, a failure as a wife and mother. He could isolate her from her family and friends. He could threaten her with violence without actually following through, keeping her in a state of perpetual fear. He could humiliate her publicly, undermine her authority with the servants, treat her with contempt in front of their children, and all of this was perfectly legal because it left no physical marks, no evidence that medieval courts would recognize as abuse. And what could a wife not say in response to this psychological cruelty? She couldn't say, "The way you speak to me is damaging my soul," because medieval people didn't have the vocabulary of emotional abuse. She couldn't say, "I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I'm losing my sense of self," because these psychological conditions weren't understood the way we understand them now. She couldn't even say, "You're being cruel," because cruelty without physical violence didn't really register as a serious complaint. So women in psychologically abusive marriages had no recourse at all. At least physical abuse left evidence that might, in extreme cases, lead to some intervention. But emotional abuse? That was invisible, unnameable, impossible to prove or complain about. There's a fascinating letter from the 15th century, part of the Paston correspondence again, where Margaret Paston is managing the family estates while her husband John is away on business. And you can read between the lines of her letters this constant anxiety. She's worried about making the wrong decisions, worried about John's reaction when he returns, apologizing constantly for things that aren't her fault. She's competent. The letters show she's actually very good at managing the estates, but she writes like someone who expects to be criticized no matter what she does. Now, we don't know if John was abusive. Maybe he was just a demanding man in a demanding time. But the dynamic Margaret's letters reveal, this constant anxiety, this need to justify every decision, This expectation of criticism, it's a dynamic that many women in marriages, medieval and modern, will recognize. And it's a dynamic that couldn't be named or addressed because it wasn't officially abuse. It was just marriage. But here's something important. Not all medieval marriages were abusive. Some were genuinely partnerships, some were affectionate, some were even loving. The existence of the legal right to violence doesn't mean every husband exercised it. Many men probably never hit their wives. Many couples probably lived together peacefully, with mutual respect and care. But the possibility of violence, the legal permission for it, coloured even the good marriages. Because every wife knew that if her husband chose to hurt her, the law would probably side with him. Every husband knew that he had this power, even if he chose not to use it. The imbalance was always there, hovering in the background, shaping the dynamics of even the most harmonious households. And this brings us to something crucial, the silence around witnessing violence. Because abuse didn't happen in a vacuum. Children saw it. Servants saw it. Neighbours heard it through the walls. And all of these people had to maintain a careful silence, because intervening in a marriage was dangerous. Children couldn't say to their father, "Stop hurting mother." To do so would be disrespecting parental authority, would be taking sides against their father, would be disrupting the household hierarchy. They had to watch, to pretend they didn't see, to grow up learning that this was normal, that this was what marriage looked like. Servants couldn't intervene either. They depended on their employer for their livelihood. To challenge the master of the house was to risk losing their position, being turned out with no references, potentially facing poverty. So servants witnessed violence and said nothing. Or maybe they whispered about it among themselves but never publicly acknowledged it. And neighbours. There's a fascinating inconsistency in medieval attitudes toward domestic violence. On one hand, community members were expected to maintain the peace, to intervene in public disturbances, but violence within a household was considered private. It was the husband's business, the family's business, not the community's concern, so neighbours might hear a woman screaming and do nothing because it's not our place to interfere between husband and wife. There are cases where neighbours did intervene, where violence became so extreme that community members felt compelled to act. But these interventions were controversial. The person who intervened might themselves face criticism for meddling in another man's household. The wife they were trying to protect might even resent the intervention because it brought shame on her family, made her husband look bad, possibly made her situation worse once the neighbours went away. So the silence around domestic violence was collective. It wasn't just the wife who couldn't speak, it was everyone around her who couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge what was happening. Now, there's one more aspect of this we need to discuss, and it's perhaps the most heartbreaking. What about men who were being abused? Because while it was rare, the power dynamics of medieval marriage made male victimization much less common. It did happen. There are references in literature and legal records to wives who were violent toward their husbands, wives who were verbally cruel, wives who made their husbands' lives miserable. And what couldn't those men say? They couldn't say anything. Because a man being abused by his wife was the ultimate humiliation. It meant he couldn't control his household. It meant he was weak, unmanly, a failure at the most basic requirement of medieval masculinity. So men in this situation had to hide it even more carefully than women did. They couldn't seek help because seeking help would be admitting their inadequacy. They couldn't complain because complaining would make them objects of mockery. There's a medieval tradition of charivari, or rough music, basically public shaming rituals. And one of the things communities would mock was a husband who let his wife dominate him. They'd parade through the streets making noise outside his house. They'd sing insulting songs. They'd sometimes make him ride backward on a donkey as punishment for his failure to control his wife. The community enforced gender hierarchy through humiliation, and this made it impossible for men in difficult marriages to ask for help. So men who were being mistreated by their wives had to suffer in absolute silence. No legal recourse, no social sympathy, no language to describe their experience without inviting mockery. And while I want to be clear that this was much rarer than wives being abused by husbands, the power imbalance meant male victimization was exceptional rather than systemic. It's still worth acknowledging that the rigid gender roles of medieval marriage trapped some men too. What we're seeing across all these silences is a pattern. Medieval marriage was built on hierarchy, on power imbalance, on the assumption that order mattered more than individual well-being, and maintaining that order required silence. Wives couldn't speak about their suffering because doing so would challenge their husband's authority. Husbands couldn't speak about their struggles because doing so would challenge the fictions of male competence. Children, servants, neighbours, everyone had to maintain the public fiction that marriages were functioning properly, that households were ordered correctly, that everything was as it should be, even when everything manifestly wasn't as it should be, even when people were being hurt, even when the silence itself was causing additional suffering. We've come so far in this journey. We've explored 11 different silences that shaped medieval marriage. Love unexpressed, money undiscussed, bodies mysterious, children judged, violence tolerated. And now we're at the final silence, the one that brings all the others into sharp relief. We haven't yet talked about how medieval couples faced death together, how they mourned each other, what they could and couldn't say when one of them was dying or had died. That's our final stop, the silence around endings, around grief, around the goodbye that had to be said under the church's watchful eye. That's where we're going now, to understand how even in death, even in the most profound moment of loss, medieval husbands and wives couldn't fully speak their hearts. When someone you love is dying, what do you say to them? In our world, we might say, "I love you." We might say, "Thank you for the life we built together." We might hold their hand and say, "I'm going to miss you so much." We might cry openly and without shame and tell them all the things we wish we'd said sooner. We might ask for forgiveness or offer it. We might simply sit in stall, a balance that's full of shared understanding rather than empty of words. But medieval couples couldn't do any of that. Not really. Because even at the deathbed, even in the final moments when you'd think all pretense would fall away, the church was there, the priest was there, well, the rules were there. And the rules said that death was about the soul, not about the relationship. Death was about preparing to meet God, not about saying goodbye to the person you'd spent your life with. When a medieval person was dying, the protocol was clear. A priest would be called to administer last rites, the final sacrament that would prepare the dying person's soul for judgment. The dying person would confess their sins, receive communion, be anointed with holy oil. Family members would be present, but they weren't the focus. The focus was entirely on the dying person's relationship with God. Everything else was secondary. So what couldn't a medieval spouse say at their partner's deathbed? They couldn't say, "Don't go." That would be questioning God's will, suggesting that earthly bonds were more important than heavenly ones. They couldn't say, "I'm not ready to lose you," because that would be placing their own needs above the dying person's spiritual journey. They couldn't even fully express their grief, because excessive emotion might distract the dying person from their prayers, might make it harder for them to face death with the proper spiritual composure. There's a medieval guide for priests called the Ars Moriendi, The Art of Dying, written in the 15th century. It's essentially an instruction manual for how to die well, how to prepare your soul for the afterlife, and it describes the proper deathbed scene. The dying person surrounded by family and friends, but focused entirely on spiritual matters. The priest asks questions about faith, about repentance, about readiness to face judgment. Family members pray quietly. Everyone maintains appropriate solemnity. What the Ars Moriendi doesn't describe is the husband reaching for his wife's hand one last time and saying, "You made my life worth living." It doesn't mention the wife leaning close to whisper, "I wish we'd had more time." It doesn't acknowledge that the people watching someone die might be experiencing profound personal grief alongside their spiritual concerns. Because personal grief was suspect, it was earthly, carnal, insufficiently focused on the eternal. You were supposed to be happy that your loved one was going to heaven, assuming they were. You were supposed to accept God's will with grace and submission. To mourn too deeply, to express too much anguish, was to reveal that you valued earthly relationships more than you should. There's a recorded case from 13th century England of a widow who was criticized by her community for excessive mourning. Her husband had died suddenly, and she was devastated. She wept constantly, refused to eat, couldn't sleep, and instead of receiving sympathy, she was told by the local priest that her grief was sinful, that she was showing too much attachment to worldly things, that she needed to accept God's will and move on. Her grief, this natural human response to losing someone she'd lived with for decades, was reframed as a moral failing. So what couldn't widows say? They couldn't say, "I'm destroyed by this loss." They couldn't say, "I don't know how to live without him." They couldn't say, "I'm angry that he's gone." All of these emotions were real, were valid, but they had to be hidden behind a mask of pious acceptance. And widowers? They faced different pressures. A man was expected to be strong, to manage his grief with dignity, to quickly resume his duties as head of household. He couldn't break down, couldn't admit to feeling lost or alone, couldn't show the depth of his pain. Medieval masculinity required emotional control even, especially, in the face of profound loss. There's something particularly cruel about the speed with which medieval life moved on after death. A person would die, be buried within a day or two. There was no embalming, no long viewing period, just a quick funeral. And then everyone was expected to return to normal life. The widow or widower had to immediately start managing the practical consequences of the death, the inheritance, the household, the children. There was no space for simply sitting with grief, no cultural permission to take time to process the loss. Widows especially were under immediate pressure to make decisions about their future. Would they remarry? Would they retire to a convent? How would they manage the estate? These weren't questions they could postpone until they'd healed from their grief. These were immediate, urgent matters that required attention, even while they were still reeling from the loss. And here's something that often gets overlooked. Medieval people died at home, surrounded by family. This meant that spouses witnessed death intimately. They saw the physical decline, the suffering, the final moments. There was no hospital to filter this experience, no medical professionals to manage the death. It was raw, immediate, unavoidable. And yet couples couldn't really discuss the dying process while it was happening. A wife couldn't say to her dying husband, "I'm frightened by what I'm seeing, by how much you're suffering." A husband couldn't tell his dying wife, "I don't know how to help you, I feel helpless." They had to maintain composure, had to focus on spiritual preparation, had to pretend that the physical reality of death wasn't as horrifying as it was. There's a type of medieval literature called the contemptus mundi, contempt for the world, that was very popular. These were texts that described in graphic detail how bodies decay after death, how beauty turns to rot, how earthly glory is meaningless. The point was to remind people not to be too attached to the physical world, to focus on eternal rather than temporary things. But imagine being told to read these texts while your spouse is dying, while you're watching the person you've lived with for decades slowly slip away. The message is clear. Don't love them too much. Don't grieve too deeply. Remember that their body is just temporary flesh that will decay. It's almost cruel in its insistence that earthly love doesn't matter as much as spiritual preparation. But despite all these restrictions, despite all the rules about proper grief and spiritual focus, some medieval people left evidence of their real feelings. There are tomb inscriptions where you can read between the formal language and see genuine emotion. There are wills where people leave specific items to their spouses, with little notes that reveal affection. There are letters written after a spouse's death that break through the formulaic language of the time to express real loss. There's a tombstone from 14th century England. The people's names have been worn away by time, but the inscription remains. It says something like, "Here lies a husband and wife who lived together 40 years in harmony." 40 years. That's a lifetime. And that word harmony, it's not dramatic, it's not poetic, but it's saying something important. These were people who made it work, who found peace together despite everything. And someone, probably the surviving spouse, wanted that recorded for posterity. Or there's a will from 15th century Italy, where a dying man leaves his wife not just her legal dower, but several personal items with notes like, "The blue cloak because she always said it brought out my eyes," and "The book of hours we read together on Sundays." These tiny details, these glimpses of actual affection and shared life, they survive in the formal legal language of a will because someone wanted to acknowledge that their marriage was more than just a legal arrangement. But these examples are exceptional precisely because they broke the rules. Most medieval people didn't leave this kind of evidence. Most went to their graves having never fully told their spouses what they meant to them, having never fully expressed their grief when their spouses died. And the children of these marriages, they learned from watching their parents that emotions should be controlled, that love shouldn't be spoken too freely, that grief should be private and brief. They learned that the proper response to loss was prayer rather than tears, acceptance rather than anger, spiritual focus rather than emotional expression. And they carried these lessons into their own marriages, perpetuating the cycle of silence. There's one more aspect of a death in medieval marriage that we need to address: remarriage. We talked earlier about how common it was. People died young, and surviving spouses often remarried. But think about what it meant to remarry after losing a spouse you'd lived with for years, possibly decades. You're still grieving, still processing the loss, and already you're being pressed to marry again. For practical reasons, for financial security, for the sake of the children. And you can't say to your new spouse, "I'm still in love with my first wife." You can't say, "I'm marrying you because I need help managing the estate, not because I have feelings for you." You can't admit that you're still grieving, still comparing, still wishing things were different. You have to perform a new marriage while still emotionally entangled with the old one. And your new spouse can't ask about your first marriage, can't say, "Tell me about them, help me understand who they were," can't acknowledge that they're entering a space still haunted by someone else's memory. Both partners have to pretend that the past doesn't matter, that they're starting fresh, that previous marriages and previous griefs have no bearing on this new arrangement. So we come to the end of our journey through the silences of medieval marriage. 12 different kinds of conversations that couldn't happen. 12 different ways that the most intimate relationship in a person's life was constrained by law, by custom, by religion, by the basic structures of medieval society. Medieval husbands and wives couldn't speak of love freely. They couldn't discuss money so honestly. They couldn't negotiate their intimate lives openly. They couldn't refuse consent or express desire without consequence. They couldn't show anger without sin. They couldn't question the value placed on sons over daughters. They couldn't challenge the double standards around adultery. They couldn't share knowledge about their own bodies. They couldn't plan together for the future after death. They couldn't speak about violence or seek protection from it. They couldn't name abuse or ask for help, and they couldn't even fully grieve each other when death came. But here's what I want you to understand as we close. Medieval people were not fundamentally different from us. They felt love, anger, grief, desire, fear, all the emotions we feel. They wanted connection, understanding, partnership, all the things we want. The difference is that they lived in a system that made expressing those feelings and wanting those things incredibly difficult, sometimes impossible, often dangerous. And yet they tried. In small ways, in hidden ways, in coded language and symbolic gestures, medieval couples found ways to communicate what they couldn't say aloud. A husband giving his wife a personal item in his will, a wife embroidering a secret message into cloth, a couple developing their own private language of looks and touches, a deathbed hand squeeze that conveyed more than any words could have. The silence wasn't total, it was pervasive, yes. It was enforced, yes. It was cruel, yes. But it wasn't absolute. Human connection finds a way, even in the most constrained circumstances. Love persists even when it can't speak its name. Understanding develops even without words. So when we look back at medieval marriage, we should feel both grief for what couldn't be said and admiration for what was communicated despite everything. We should recognize how fortunate we are to live in a time when we can speak more freely, love more openly, build partnerships based on honesty and choice rather than duty and silence. But we should also recognize that the impulse to control intimate relationships, to enforce silence around difficult truths, to prioritize social order over individual well-being, that impulse didn't die with the Middle Ages. We still struggle with many of these silences in different forms. We still have conversations we're afraid to have, truths we're afraid to speak, emotions we're afraid to show. We're still learning how to be fully honest with the people we love, how to create relationships built on genuine communication rather than assumed understanding. The medieval couples we've talked about tonight, they couldn't have those conversations. We can. That's a gift. Use it. Thank you for staying with me through this long, quiet journey into the silences of medieval marriage. I hope it's given you something to think about, some new understanding of how our ancestors lived and loved. If you found value in this story, I'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might appreciate it too. And I hope you'll join me again soon for another journey into the forgotten corners of history, another exploration of the lives of people who came before us. Sleep well, and perhaps before you drift off, think about the person next to you if there is one. Think about all the things medieval couples couldn't say to each other, and maybe, just maybe, say one of those things out loud. Say I love you, or thank you, or I'm glad you're here. Say the words that couldn't be spoken then but can be spoken now. Until next time, good night.